It is tempting, when we begin to trace the outline of a life as tangled and influential as that of Sigmund Freud, to think of him first as a set of ideas, as the father of psychoanalysis, the architect of the unconscious. Yet the story of the man behind the theory is a story of a particular time, a particular city, a particular set of personal encounters and disappointments that shaped the way he listened to the whispers of the mind. To understand Freud fully, we must walk with him from the cobblestones of the Viennese quarter where he was born, through the lecture halls of the University of Vienna, into the cramped rooms of his private practice, and finally across the war-torn continent to a modest flat in Hampstead, London, where he spent his final years. Along the way, we will meet the colleagues who challenged him, the patients who opened doors he had not known existed, and the intellectual currents that both buoyed and threatened his work. Vienna in the late 19th century was a city of contradictions. Its imperial grandeur, its coffeehouses humming with debate, its opera houses and museums, all coexisted with cramped tenements and a swelling population of Jews, artisans, and intellectuals. Freud entered this world on the first day of May in 1856, the seventh of 8 children in a family that had moved from the Moravian town of Miskolc to the bustling district of Alsergrund. His father, Jacob, was a wool merchant, a man of modest means but of considerable ambition for his children. He hoped that one of his sons would become a physician, a respectable profession that would elevate the family's standing. In a household where Hebrew prayers mingled with German lullabies, young Sigmund was exposed early to a duality that would later echo in his own theories: the tension between the public self and the private, often hidden, interior life. From the start, Freud displayed a keen intellect, a restless curiosity that set him apart from his siblings. He excelled in school, absorbing the classical languages and the burgeoning sciences with equal vigor. Yet even as a teenager he felt a certain unease, a sense that the world around him was composed of layers he could not fully see. He wrote later in a letter to his friend Wilhelm Fliess, "I have always been fascinated by the invisible forces that drive human behavior, the forces that lie beneath the surface of our conscious thoughts." This early fascination would become the seed from which his later theories sprouted. When Freud entered the University of Vienna in 1873, the intellectual climate was already shifting dramatically. The positivist optimism of Auguste Comte had given way to a more skeptical, empirically driven approach to knowledge. In the natural sciences, Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species had ignited debates about evolution, adaptation, and the mechanisms of change. In psychology, Wilhelm Wundt, often called the father of experimental psychology, had established his laboratory in Leipzig in 1879, emphasizing introspection and measurement. At the same time, the field of neurology was burgeoning, with physicians like Jean-Martin Charcot in Paris demonstrating that neurological disorders could manifest as vivid, symbolic phenomena. The French neurologist's work on hysteria, in particular, would capture the imagination of a young Freud. Freud's medical training, which he began in 1873, was rigorous and eclectic. He studied anatomy, physiology, pathology, and pharmacology, rotating through the various hospitals of Vienna. It was here that he first encountered the case of Anna O., a young woman treated by Joseph Breuer for what was then called hysteria. The treatment, known as the talking cure, involved encouraging the patient to articulate her memories and sensations, a process that seemed to alleviate her symptoms. Though Freud was not directly involved in Breuer's work with Anna O., the case left an indelible impression on him. He later wrote, "It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing a hidden world of psychic activity that could be accessed through language." In 1881, after completing his doctorate with a dissertation on the anatomy of the cerebellum, Freud began his residency at the General Hospital of Vienna. He was appointed as a private dozent, a private lecturer, by 1885, a position that required him to teach without a salary, relying instead on student fees. It was a precarious existence, but it also gave him the freedom to explore ideas outside the strict confines of the university curriculum. He lectured on the anatomy of the nervous system, on the pathology of the brain, and, increasingly, on the psychological dimensions of disease. His early lectures hinted at an emerging skepticism toward the purely physiological explanations that dominated the medical establishment. The turning point came in 1885, when Freud met Joseph Breuer, a distinguished physician who had already made a name for himself with his work on hysteria and the cathartic method. Their collaboration would produce studies on hysteria, published in 1895, a text that marked the first systematic presentation of what would later become psychoanalytic theory. In that work, Freud and Breuer described cases in which patients, through the free expression of repressed memories and emotions, experienced relief from their symptoms. The famous case of the little hands, a young boy whose phobia of horses was linked to an Oedipal conflict, illustrated how seemingly trivial anxieties could be rooted in deeper, unconscious desires. Freud's partnership with Breuer was not without tension. While Breuer remained committed to the idea that hysteria could be cured through the cathartic release of emotional energy, Freud began to suspect that the process was more complex. He proposed that the unconscious mind held not only repressed memories, but also a systematic set of drives, what he would later call the id, ego, and superego. This divergence in perspective eventually led to a professional rift, with Breuer withdrawing from the project and Freud forging ahead on his own path. The publication of the Interpretation of Dreams in 1900 stands as one of the most dramatic anecdotes in Freud's career. The manuscript, painstakingly assembled over a decade, was initially rejected by several publishers who deemed it too speculative, too daring for the scientific community. Freud, undeterred, turned to his friend and publisher, Franz Judek, who agreed to print the work on the condition that Freud would shoulder the costs. The book's first edition consisted of a modest print run, and the initial sales were modest at best. Yet within the pages of that volume, Freud introduced the revolutionary concept of dream symbolism, the idea that dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. He wrote, "Dreams are the disguised fulfillments of repressed wishes." The delayed publication, the financial risk, and the tepid reception did not deter Freud. Instead, they reinforced his conviction that he was charting a new territory, one that required patience and perseverance. Freud's personal life also intertwined with his professional development. In 1886, he married Martha Bernays, a woman from a respectable Jewish family. Their marriage was a partnership of intellect and affection, though not without its strains. Martha's support enabled Freud to pursue his research while raising their 6 children. Yet the demands of his practice, the long hours spent listening to patients' confessions, and the growing controversy surrounding his theories placed a heavy burden on their household. Freud often confessed in letters to feeling torn between his roles as husband, father, and scientist. He wrote to Martha in 1899, "I am consumed by a fire that I cannot extinguish, a fire that drives me to uncover the hidden currents of the human soul, even as it threatens to consume the very foundations of our domestic life." The early 1900s saw Freud's ideas begin to coalesce into a more formal structure. In 1902, he founded the Psychoanalytic Society, a small group of physicians and scholars who met in his apartment to discuss the latest developments in the field. The Society's inaugural meeting included figures such as Carl Gustav Jung, Alfred Adler, and Otto Rank, young men who would each, in turn, become prominent voices in the evolving discourse on the psyche. The Society served as a crucible for debate, a place where Freud could test his theories against the critiques of his peers. It was here that the concept of transference, patients projecting feelings onto their analyst, was first articulated, a notion that would become central to psychoanalytic practice. Freud's relationship with Carl Jung, in particular, offers a vivid illustration of the intellectual fervor of the time. The two first met in 1907, when Jung, then a Swiss psychiatrist, wrote to Freud expressing admiration for his work. Their correspondence blossomed into a friendship that seemed poised to unite the Germanic and the Swiss schools of thought. In 1913, at the International Congress of Psychoanalysis in Zurich, the two men engaged in a heated debate that would later be seen as a watershed moment. Jung challenged Freud's emphasis on sexual drives as the primary motivator of human behavior, proposing instead that a broader collective unconscious, a reservoir of archetypal symbols shared across cultures, played a crucial role. Freud, ever the defender of his own framework, retorted, "If we abandon the sexual instinct as the cornerstone of our theory, we risk reducing the psyche to a mere collection of cultural myths." The debate was intense, the audience divided, and the outcome was a gradual estrangement that culminated in Jung's formal break from Freud's circle in 1914. This rupture not only marked a personal schism, but also signaled the diversification of psychoanalytic thought into multiple strands. While Freud was wrestling with his inner circle, the broader intellectual climate of fin de siècle Europe was undergoing its own transformations. Positivism, championed by figures like Auguste Comte and later by Ernst Mach, insisted that knowledge must be derived from observable, empirical data. In contrast, Darwinism introduced the notion that life is shaped by forces of selection and adaptation, suggesting that human behavior could be understood as an evolutionary product. The rise of neurology, with its focus on brain pathology, offered a seemingly concrete foundation for understanding mental illness. Yet, Freud found these approaches insufficient to capture the depth of human experience. He argued the mind is not a machine that can be dissected into parts. It is a living, dynamic system, constantly in flux, and its hidden forces cannot be measured by the ruler of the laboratory. His divergence from mainstream psychology was thus both a philosophical and methodological choice, one that placed him at odds with the positivist insistence on quantifiable data. To appreciate the distinctiveness of Freud's position, it is helpful to contrast him with contemporaries such as Wilhelm Wundt and Peer Janet. Wundt, often hailed as the father of experimental psychology, established the first laboratory dedicated to psychological research in Leipzig. He emphasized introspection, trained subjects reporting their immediate experiences as a means to uncover the structures of consciousness. Wundt's approach was systematic, seeking to isolate elemental sensations and construct a hierarchy of mental processes. Freud, on the other hand, rejected the notion that conscious introspection could reveal the deepest layers of the mind. He believed that the unconscious was not accessible through simple self-report, but required a more indirect method, free association, dream analysis, and the interpretation of slips of the tongue. Peer Janet, a French psychologist and neurologist, offered yet another point of comparison. Janet's work on dissociation and psychological trauma was pioneering. He described how traumatic experiences could fragment the mind, leading to what he termed subpersonalities. While Janet's focus on the fragmentation of consciousness echoed some of Freud's concerns, he remained committed to a more physiological explanation, emphasizing the role of the nervous system and the concept of psychic automatism. Freud, in contrast, posited that unconscious drives, rooted in sexuality and aggression, were the primary engines of psychic life. He famously wrote to Janet, "Your studies are admirable, yet they stop short of confronting the fundamental source of psychic conflict, the instinctual forces that lie beneath the surface of awareness." Freud's ideas also intersected with the cultural milieu of Vienna, a city that was, at the time, a crucible of artistic and intellectual innovation. The Vienna Secession, led by artists such as Gustav Klimt, challenged the conventions of academic art, seeking new forms of expression that could capture the inner emotional world. In literature, writers like Arthur Schnitzler explored the complexities of desire and morality, often delving into the unconscious motivations of their characters. Freud's own circle included the composer Gustav Mahler, whose symphonies, with their sweeping emotional arcs, resonated with Freud's notion of the unconscious as a source of both terror and beauty. These cross-currents reinforced Freud's conviction that the psyche could not be reduced to a set of observable behaviors. It required a language that could articulate the symbolic, the metaphorical, the deeply personal. The years leading up to the First World War saw Freud's influence expand beyond Vienna. He traveled to the United States in 1909, giving lectures at Clark University, where he met the American psychologist G. Stanley Hall. Hall, a proponent of evolutionary psychology, was fascinated by Freud's ideas about the development of the ego and the role of childhood experiences. In his lecture, Freud introduced the concept of psychic determinism, arguing that every mental event is the result of preceding events, even those hidden from conscious awareness. He declared there is no such thing as a spontaneous thought. Every thought has a cause, and that cause can be traced back to the unconscious. This principle would become a cornerstone of psychoanalytic therapy, guiding analysts to uncover the chain of causality that linked present symptoms to past experiences. Yet the outbreak of war in 1914 altered the trajectory of Freud's life dramatically. As a Jew in Austria-Hungary, he faced growing anti-Semitic sentiment, and the political upheaval threatened his safety. He remained in Vienna throughout the war, continuing his practice and writing, but the atmosphere of uncertainty weighed heavily upon him. In 1919, after the war's end, he published Beyond the Pleasure Principle, a work that introduced the concept of the death drive, an instinctual force that pushes individuals toward dissolution and self-destruction. This notion, which seemed to contradict the earlier emphasis on the pleasure principle, sparked intense debate among his followers and critics alike. Some saw it as a bold expansion of psychoanalytic theory. Others, such as Adler, argued that it undermined the therapeutic optimism that had guided their practice. Freud's final exile began in 1938 when the Anschluss, Nazi Germany's annexation of Austria, made life for Jews in Vienna untenable. At the age of 82, Freud was forced to flee, first to Paris, then to London, where he was welcomed by a small community of psychoanalysts who had already established a foothold in England. In London, he settled in a modest flat on Gower Street, a stone's throw from the British Museum. The move was both a physical relocation and a symbolic transition. Freud, the Viennese intellectual, became a refugee, an elder statesman of a discipline that was still in its infancy. In his final years, he continued to write Dictating Moses and Monotheism, a controversial work that examined the origins of religion through a psychoanalytic lens, to his assistant, Ernst Simmel. In the manuscript, Freud posited that Moses was an Egyptian priest who introduced monotheism to the Hebrews, a hypothesis that drew both fascination and condemnation. Freud's health, however, deteriorated rapidly. He suffered from jaw cancer, a condition that required multiple surgeries and left him in constant pain. Despite his physical decline, his mind remained sharp. He reflected on his legacy in a letter to his close friend, Lou Andreas Salome, writing, "I have devoted my life to uncovering the hidden currents that shape our thoughts and actions. If I have succeeded in opening even a single window onto the unconscious, then my suffering will have been worthwhile." On September 23, 1939, just weeks after Britain entered the Second World War, Freud passed away in his London flat, surrounded by his family and a few loyal colleagues. The story of Freud's life, from his Viennese upbringing to his exile in London, is more than a biographical sketch. It is a narrative of how a particular set of historical, cultural, and intellectual forces converged to give rise to a revolutionary way of understanding the human mind. His medical training grounded him in the biological sciences, yet his encounters with patients like Anna O and his collaboration with Breuer opened a door to the psychological realm. The delayed publication of The Interpretation of Dreams illustrates his perseverance in the face of skepticism, while his debate with Jung at the 1913 Zurich Congress exemplifies the dynamic, often contentious, evolution of his ideas. Freud's departure from mainstream psychology can be seen most clearly when we juxtapose his work with that of Wilhelm Wundt and Peer Janet. Wundt's laboratory, with its emphasis on controlled experiments and quantifiable data, represented a positivist approach that sought to map the mind in the same way a chemist maps a reaction. Janet's focus on dissociation and trauma offered a bridge between neurology and psychology, yet remained anchored in a physiological framework. Freud, by contrast, insisted that the psyche harbored forces, desires, fears, fantasies, that could not be directly observed but could be inferred through symbolic expression. He famously wrote, "The interpretation of dreams is the royal road to a knowledge of the unconscious activities of the mind." This claim positioned psychoanalysis as a hermeneutic discipline, one that required interpretation, narrative, and an appreciation for the metaphorical language of the unconscious. The intellectual climate of fin de siècle Europe also played a decisive role. Positivism, with its insistence on observable facts, clashed with the burgeoning interest in the irrational, the symbolic, and the artistic. Darwinism offered a naturalistic explanation for human behavior, but left open the question of how evolutionary pressures translated into the inner life of individuals. Neurology provided tools to locate lesions and diagnose disorders, yet could not account for the symbolic meaning that patients attached to their symptoms. Freud navigated these currents, borrowing from each where useful, but ultimately forging a path that emphasized the importance of unconscious processes, symbolic meaning, and the therapeutic relationship. His influence extended beyond the confines of psychology. In literature, the stream of consciousness techniques employed by James Joyce and Virginia Woolf echo Freud's insistence that the mind is a flowing, often contradictory, stream of thoughts, memories, and desires. In the visual arts, surrealists like Salvador Dali drew directly from Freudian concepts, portraying dreamlike landscapes that visualized the unconscious. Even in contemporary neuroscience, researchers investigating the default mode network, a set of brain regions active during rest and introspection, find echoes of Freud's ideas about the mind's intrinsic activity when not engaged in external tasks. The anecdotes that punctuate Freud's life serve as reminders that the development of ideas is rarely a smooth, linear progression. The delayed publication of The Interpretation of Dreams underscores how groundbreaking work can be met with resistance, financial risk, and institutional skepticism. Yet the very fact that the book eventually found its audience illustrates the power of perseverance and the eventual resonance of ideas that tap into fundamental aspects of human experience. The heated debate with Jung at Zurich, meanwhile, demonstrates how intellectual disagreements can catalyze new directions, spawning alternative models such as Jung's collective unconscious and archetypal analysis, concepts that continue to influence psychotherapy, literary criticism, and cultural studies. Freud's exile to London also offers a poignant illustration of how historical forces, political upheaval, anti-Semitic persecution, war, intersect with the personal trajectories of thinkers. In London, he found a community that valued his contributions, yet he also witnessed the fragmentation of his original circle. His later works, such as Moses and Monotheism, reveal a mind still eager to apply psychoanalytic insight to broader cultural phenomena, even as his physical health declined. The persistence of his ideas, despite these challenges, speaks to the depth of his intellectual curiosity and his belief in the transformative potential of uncovering the hidden layers of the mind. In reflecting upon Freud's life, one cannot ignore the moral and ethical questions that have surrounded his work. Critics have pointed to his emphasis on sexuality, his sometimes deterministic view of human behavior, and his controversial methods of patient treatment. Yet even his detractors acknowledge that Freud opened a dialogue about topics that had previously been considered taboo: the role of childhood experience, the significance of dreams, the existence of internal conflicts. He forced the scientific community to confront the reality that not all aspects of human experience can be reduced to observable data. That meaning, symbolism, and narrative hold a vital place in our understanding of ourselves. Freud's legacy, therefore, is not a monolithic doctrine but a tapestry woven from his personal experiences, his collaborations, his disputes, and the broader cultural currents of his time. His journey from the bustling streets of Vienna to the quiet lanes of Hampstead reflects the resilience of a mind that refused to accept the limits imposed by contemporary science. It also reminds us that the development of any theory is inseparable from the life of its creator, from the friendships that nurture it, the debates that challenge it, and the historical forces that shape its reception. As we consider the man behind the theory, we might ask ourselves, what would Freud say about the modern world, with its digital networks, its neuroimaging technologies, its ever-accelerating pace of life? Would he view the endless stream of information as a new form of repression, a way to keep unconscious desires at bay? Or would he celebrate the opportunities for self-exploration that contemporary tools provide? Perhaps the answer lies not in speculation, but in the very method he championed: listening, interpreting, and remaining attuned to the hidden currents that underlie every thought and action. In the end, Sigmund Freud remains a figure who embodies both the brilliance and the controversy of a transformative era. His life story, rich with anecdotes, intellectual battles, and personal sacrifices, offers a window into the birth of a discipline that continues to evolve, to be challenged, and to inspire. By tracing his biographical trajectory, from his Viennese upbringing through his medical training, his collaborations, his founding of the Psychoanalytic Society, his confrontations with Jung, to his final exile in London, we gain not only a deeper appreciation for his theories, but also an understanding of how history, culture, and personal experience converge to shape the ideas that define our understanding of the human mind. Imagine the mind as a grand three-story house, each floor humming with its own purpose, its own voice. On the basement level lives the id, that primal instinctual engine that pulses with the raw demands of hunger, thirst, sex, and aggression. It knows no calendar, no courtesy, no moral code. It simply whispers, "I want, I need, I must," in a language of pleasure and pain. Ascending one level, we encounter the ego, the diligent steward of reality, the middle manager who translates the id's urgent telegrams into workable plans, negotiating with the external world, weighing consequences, saying, "Perhaps we can have that, but not now, not here." Finally, perched on the attic, the superego stands as the house's moral compass, the internalized voice of parents, teachers, and culture. A stern overseer that rewards virtue and condemns transgression. Together, these three structures, id, ego, superego, form the tripartite model that Sigmund Freud first sketched in his 1923 work, The Ego and the Id. Freud's metaphor of the mind as a house is not merely decorative, it serves as a vivid guide for everyday experience. Picture a child who, after a long day at school, rushes home and devours a bag of candy in secret. The id is the child's immediate craving for sweetness, the ego is the part that knows the rules about bedtime and sugar limits, and the superego is the internalized parental voice that whispers, "You must be disciplined." When the ego fails to mediate, the id erupts and the child may feel guilt, a classic example of the tension that fuels much of human behavior. Freud's structural model was not born in a vacuum. It emerged from his earlier explorations of the unconscious, his work with hysteria patients, and his fascination with dreams as the royal road to the unconscious. In The Ego and the Id, he writes, "The ego is thus the representative of the whole personality, which includes both the conscious and the preconscious. The superego," he adds, "is the internalized moral authority, the conscience, which is the result of the child's identification with the parents." These statements, drawn directly from Freud's own words, set the stage for his later, more detailed mapping of human development, the psychosexual stages. Freud proposed that the mind's architecture is sculpted through a series of 5 psychosexual stages, each defined by the erogenous zone that dominates the child's libidinal energy at that time. The first is the oral stage, spanning roughly the first 18 months of life. Here, the mouth is the primary source of pleasure, sucking, biting, chewing. The infant's world is a series of tastes and textures, and the act of nursing becomes a symbolic exchange of love and security. Freud argued that if the infant's oral needs are either overindulged or frustrated, a fixation can linger into adulthood, manifesting as an oral personality. Consider the modern smoker who reaches for a cigarette during a stressful meeting, the ritual of lighting, inhaling, exhaling, and the brief, soothing sensation that follows. This is a classic oral fixation, a lingering echo of an unmet or overly satisfied need for oral gratification in infancy. Another illustration might be the compulsive overeater who finds comfort in the act of chewing, using food as a surrogate for the soothing suckling experience that once soothed a hungry infant. Both behaviors echo the oral stage's focus on nourishment and the oral pleasure principle. As Freud noted in 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, the oral phase is the first period of libidinal development and the first point at which the infant may become fixated. The second stage, the anal stage, occupies roughly the ages of 18 months to 3 years. The child's pleasure now centers on the control of elimination, holding in and expelling feces. The conflict that emerges here is not merely physiological but symbolic. It becomes a lesson in authority, order, and autonomy. When parents impose strict toilet training regimens, the child learns to associate compliance with praise and defiance with punishment. Freud suggested that the resolution, or lack thereof, of this stage gives rise to 2 contrasting adult personalities: the anal retentive and the anal expulsive. An anal retentive adult might be meticulously organized, overly punctual, and prone to obsessive-compulsive traits. Think of the colleague who insists on aligning every document to the exact margin, who feels a deep, inexplicable anxiety when a pencil is left uncapped. This is the modern echo of a child who learned to hold back to control, to gain approval through restraint. Conversely, an anal expulsive personality may be messy, disorganized, and prone to generosity that borders on recklessness. Perhaps the friend who throws away possessions without a second thought, or the artist who lives in a studio cluttered with unfinished canvases. Freud described the anal stage as the period of the greatest conflict between the desire for self-assertion and the demands of the external world. The third stage, the phallic stage, runs from ages 3 to 6. Here the focus shifts to the genitals and a new, more complex drama unfolds, the Oedipus complex. In this narrative, the child develops an unconscious sexual desire for the opposite sex parent and a rivalrous feeling toward the same-sex parent. For a boy, this manifests as a longing for his mother and a fear of castration by his father. For a girl, Freud later introduced the concept of penis envy, a desire for the symbolic power associated with the male organ and a rivalry with the mother. The resolution of this conflict, through identification with the same-sex parent, is what Freud believed to lay the groundwork for the superego's moral authority. A contemporary illustration of an unresolved phallic conflict might be seen in an adult who constantly seeks validation from a romantic partner, fearing abandonment, and who may react with jealousy when the partner forms close friendships with the opposite sex. Another example could be a man who, despite professional success, feels an inexplicable need to prove his masculinity through risky behavior, perhaps extreme sports or aggressive bargaining, reflecting an unconscious struggle to affirm his phallic identity. Freud wrote in The Interpretation of Dreams, the Oedipus complex is the central and most important factor in the development of the personality. After the phallic stage, the child enters latency, a period of relative calm from roughly 6 years until puberty. Sexual energy, according to Freud, is sublimated into socially acceptable pursuits, school, friendships, hobbies. The child's focus turns outward, toward learning and peer relationships, allowing the ego and superego to consolidate. Yet even in latency, the foundations laid in earlier stages continue to influence behavior. A child who has developed a strong superego may excel academically, driven by an internalized sense of duty. One with a weaker superego might gravitate toward mischievous but non-destructive antics, testing boundaries without overt rebellion. The final stage, the genital stage, begins at puberty and extends into adulthood. Here, the libido reorients toward mature, reciprocal relationships. The individual seeks love that balances sexual desire with emotional intimacy, ideally integrating the lessons learned in earlier stages. Success in this stage is marked by the capacity for genuine affection, commitment, and the ability to love without the anxieties that once haunted the phallic period. Freud emphasized that the genital stage is the culmination of the whole psychosexual development, the point at which the individual can finally relate to the world in a fully mature way. Freud's model does not stop at describing stages. It also identifies the mechanisms by which the mind protects itself from painful or socially unacceptable thoughts. Repression, the cornerstone of his theory, is the process by which the ego pushes threatening ideas into the unconscious. Imagine a person who, after a traumatic breakup, cannot recall the details of the relationship at all, only fragments surface in dreams or slips of the tongue. That is repression at work, a defensive wall built by the ego to keep distressing material from flooding consciousness. Displacement, another key mechanism, involves shifting emotional energy from a threatening target to a safer one. A classic example might be the employee who, after receiving criticism from a superior, returns home and snaps at a family member. The original source of frustration is displaced onto a less threatening figure, allowing the ego to vent the built-up tension without confronting the true source. Freud noted displacement is a process by which the mind transfers a feeling from its original object to a substitute, less threatening object. Sublimation, perhaps the most socially constructive defense, redirects instinctual drives into culturally valued activities. The aggressive impulses of a young man might be channeled into competitive sports, or the sexual energies of an artist might be expressed through painting. Freud saw sublimation as evidence that the unconscious could be harnessed for creative and productive ends. Sublimation is the transformation of an instinctual impulse into a socially acceptable activity. All of these mechanisms operate within the dynamic interplay of the id, ego, and superego. The ego, acting as the executive, decides which defense to employ based on the strength of the superego's moral demands and the id's raw impulses. When the superego is overly harsh, the ego may resort to repression or reaction formation, leading to neurotic patterns. When the superego is weak, the id may dominate, resulting in impulsivity. This delicate balance is what Freud believed underlies both healthy functioning and psychopathology. To understand how Freud arrived at these ideas, we must turn to the historical context of his work. In 1909, Freud wrote a passionate, almost feverish letter to his confidant Wilhelm Fliess, describing what he later called the death drive or thanatos. In that correspondence, he confessed, "I am convinced that there exists a fundamental instinctual drive toward the return to an inorganic state, a drive that is as powerful as the life-preserving instincts," though the death drive would not be formally introduced until beyond the pleasure principle in 1920. The 1909 letter reveals Freud's early wrestling with the paradox of a mind that seeks both pleasure and self-destruction. This tension would later inform his broader theory of the unconscious, suggesting that the id is not merely a pleasure-seeking entity, but also harbors a destructive, self-annihilating force. A more public illustration of Freud's controversial impact occurred in 1915 during the infamous Miller case. Miller, a wealthy American businessman, sued a newspaper for libel after it published an article insinuating that his wife was suffering from a neurosis that Freud had allegedly diagnosed. Freud was called to testify, and his clinical language, talking openly about sexual fantasies, infantile memories, and repressed desires, shocked the courtroom and the broader public. The trial turned into a media circus, with headlines branding Freud a sex-obsessed charlatan. Yet, amidst the scandal, the case highlighted the cultural clash between emerging psychoanalytic ideas and the prevailing Victorian morality of the time. It also underscored the real-world stakes of Freud's theories, that a physician's interpretation of the unconscious could have profound legal and social consequences. Freud's ideas did not develop in isolation. His contemporary Carl Jung took the concept of the unconscious further, proposing a collective unconscious populated by archetypes, universal symbols like the mother, the hero, the shadow. While Freud emphasized personal, repressed sexual and aggressive drives, Jung argued that these personal unconscious contents were only a fraction of a deeper, shared psychic reservoir. Jung's archetypes can be seen as a macro-level expansion of Freud's id, a kind of universal id that shapes myths, religions, and cultural narratives across time. The dialogue between Freud and Jung, initially collaborative and later fractious, illustrates how the tripartite model inspired broader explorations of the human psyche. Alfred Adler, another early disciple, diverged sharply from Freud by focusing on feelings of inferiority and the drive for superiority. Adler's birth order theory, suggesting that firstborn children tend to be more responsible and achievement-oriented, while later-borns may be more rebellious, offers an alternative lens on personality development that does not rely on sexual stages. Adler argued that the core motivational force is not sexual energy, but the striving for significance and social belonging. In this sense, Adler's style of life can be viewed as a counterpoint to Freud's psychosexual script, emphasizing social context over internal drives. The influence of Freud's structural model has also been examined through the eyes of behaviorists, who rose to prominence in the early 20th century. B.F. Skinner, a leading figure in operant conditioning, dismissed the notion of an unconscious mind altogether, arguing that behavior could be fully explained by observable stimuli and responses. Skinner famously wrote, "The greatest mistake in the history of psychology is the belief that mental processes can be inferred from behavior." From the behaviorist perspective, the id, ego, and superego are unnecessary metaphors. What matters are the reinforcement schedules that shape habits, not the hidden conflicts that Freud proposed. Similarly, John B. Watson, the father of behaviorism, insisted that psychology should be the science of observable behavior, rejecting introspection and the talk of repressed wishes. These critiques challenged Freud's dominance, prompting a shift in the field toward experimental, measurable approaches. More recently, cognitive psychologists have offered another line of critique, drawing on the work of Daniel Kahneman and his dual system theory of thinking. Kahneman's System 1, fast, automatic, intuitive, and System 2, slow, deliberative, reflective, mirror, in a modern guise, the tension between unconscious impulses and conscious regulation. Yet Kahneman's model is grounded in empirical research on decision-making, heuristics, and biases, rather than on the speculative dynamics of the id-ego-superego. In his Thinking Fast and Slow, Kahneman notes, "Our minds are prone to systematic errors, but these errors arise from the way information is processed, not from repressed wishes." This cognitive critique suggests that many phenomena Freud attributed to repression or displacement may instead be the result of bounded rationality and informational shortcuts. Nevertheless, Freud's theories have persisted, in part because they offer a rich, narrative framework that resonates with lived experience. Karen Horney, a prominent neo-Freudian, reinterpreted the drive towards self-actualization not as a quest for sexual gratification, but as a yearning for security and autonomy. She critiqued Freud's emphasis on penis envy, proposing instead that women's feelings of inferiority stem from cultural oppression, not biological deficiency. Horney's work illustrates how Freud's structural concepts can be reshaped to address gender, culture, and social power. Ernest Jones, Freud's biographer, defended the core of the psychosexual model, emphasizing that the stages are not arbitrary divisions, but represent genuine developmental milestones, each with its own set of conflicts and potentials. Jones's advocacy helped preserve Freud's legacy during the early 20th century onslaught of criticism. To see the structural model in action, consider a contemporary scenario. A young professional, Maya, feels a persistent anxiety about making mistakes at work. Her id whispers, "I want immediate relief, take a break, avoid the task." Her superego, shaped by years of parental expectations, scolds, "You must be perfect." Any error reflects your worth. The ego, caught in the middle, chooses a coping strategy. Perhaps it employs displacement, venting frustration onto a colleague, or sublimation, channeling anxiety into meticulous planning. If Maya repeatedly represses her fear, she may develop psychosomatic headaches, a classic Freudian symptom where repressed anxiety manifests physically. This everyday drama illustrates the ongoing negotiation among the three agencies of the mind. Another example comes from the realm of addiction. Consider Thomas, who has been smoking since his teenage years. The act of lighting a cigarette offers a brief return to the oral pleasure of his infancy, a symbolic return to the comfort of the breast. The id craves the nicotine's rush, the superego condemns it as unhealthy. The ego, seeking to reduce inner conflict, may rationalize the habit as a stress reliever. Over time, the behavior becomes entrenched, not merely because of chemical dependence, but because it serves as a defensive mechanism, repression of deeper anxieties, displacement of work stress onto a cigarette, and even sublimation when Thomas channels the ritual into a social bonding activity with peers. Freud would argue that the oral fixation, rooted in an unresolved early stage, has found a modern outlet in nicotine addiction. Freud's notion of the death drive, introduced in the early 1920s, adds a darker hue to his structural model. He posited that alongside the life-preserving eros, there exists an instinctual pull toward dissolution, a desire to return to an inorganic state. This concept, hinted at in his 1909 letter to Fleece, suggests that the id contains not only appetitive forces, but also a counter-force that can manifest as self-destructive behavior, risk-taking, or even artistic self-sacrifice. In contemporary terms, the death drive can be likened to the modern psychological concept of self-handicapping, where individuals unconsciously create obstacles that guarantee failure, thereby preserving self-esteem by providing an external excuse. The legacy of Freud's structural model and psychosexual stages continues to reverberate through modern psychotherapy. In psychodynamic therapy, clinicians still explore transference, how a patient projects feelings toward the therapist that echo early parent-child dynamics. This process is essentially a reenactment of the Oedipus complex, where the therapist becomes a stand-in for the parental figures, allowing the patient to work through unresolved conflicts. The therapist helps the ego strengthen its capacity to mediate, encouraging healthier defenses, perhaps replacing repression with insight, displacement with constructive expression, and sublimation with creative pursuits. In popular culture, the id, ego, and superego have become shorthand for internal conflict. Films like Inside Out anthropomorphize these forces, presenting joy, sadness, anger, fear, and disgust as characters that govern a child's emotional life. While the movie simplifies Freud's ideas, it captures the essence of a mind constantly balancing competing impulses. Similarly, the phrase "talking to your inner child" echoes the psychosexual emphasis on early developmental stages, encouraging individuals to revisit and heal the wounds of the oral, anal, or phallic periods. Cross-referencing further, Jung's archetype of the shadow, representing the denied, darker aspects of the self, parallels Freud's concept of the id, the repository of instinctual drives. Yet Jung expands the shadow into a collective dimension, suggesting that each individual's personal id is a fragment of a larger mythic reservoir. Adler's birth order theory, meanwhile, offers an alternative explanation for traits that Freud might attribute to fixation. A firstborn sense of responsibility could be interpreted as an anal retentive tendency, but Adler would argue it stems from the child's position in the family hierarchy, not from an unresolved toilet training conflict. These dialogues illustrate how Freud's framework serves as a springboard for diverse psychological theories. Let us return to the mechanisms of defense, this time with a concrete illustration of displacement in a modern workplace. Imagine a manager, Alina, who receives a terse email from her superior criticizing a project she spearheaded. The criticism triggers a surge of anger, but the superego's internalized standards of professionalism prevent her from confronting the boss directly. Instead, Alina's ego redirects the anger toward a subordinate, chastising them for a minor mistake unrelated to the project. The subordinate, bewildered, experiences the emotional fallout, while Alina's ego maintains the external peace. This displacement not only preserves Alina's self-image, but also perpetuates a cycle of tension within the team. In another scenario, consider sublimation in the arts. The poet Sylvia, haunted by intense, forbidden desires, channels those urges into verses that explore love, loss, and longing. The raw sexual energy of the id is transformed into metaphor, rhythm, and imagery, an act that satisfies the drive while conforming to societal norms. Freud praised such transformations, noting that sublimation is the most successful of all defenses, for it converts the instinct into a socially valuable product. The poet's work, then, becomes a living testament to the mind's capacity to re-engineer instinctual impulses into cultural artifacts. Freud's theory of repression also underlies many modern understandings of trauma. In post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, individuals often experience intrusive memories, flashbacks, or nightmares that seem to breach the protective wall of repression. Contemporary research suggests that the brain's memory systems may compartmentalize traumatic events, a process that aligns with Freud's notion of pushing unbearable material into the unconscious. Yet, unlike Freud's purely psychic explanation, modern neuroscience locates these processes in neural networks involving the amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex. The convergence of Freud's clinical observations with modern brain science demonstrates how his concepts can be reframed within a biological context. Turning again to historical anecdotes, Freud's 1909 letter to Fliess not only introduced the death drive, but also revealed his willingness to speculate beyond the data of his clinical practice. He wrote, "The death instinct is a powerful force, a counterbalance to the life instinct, and its influence can be felt in the most unexpected of human actions." This bold conjecture, made at a time when the concept of an unconscious drive towards self-destruction was revolutionary, set the stage for later debates about aggression, war, and the human capacity for self-sacrifice. Critics have accused Freud of overreaching, yet the death drive remains a provocative lens through which psychologists examine phenomena such as self-harm, risk-taking, and even the allure of martyrdom. The Miller case of 1915, by contrast, placed Freud's ideas under the unforgiving glare of public scrutiny. When the courtroom demanded that Freud explain the neurosis of Miller's wife in plain language, he responded with clinical terminology that seemed obscene to the lay audience. The press seized upon his talk of penis envy and repressed sexual fantasies, casting him as a provocateur. Yet the scandal also sparked a wider conversation about the legitimacy of exploring the unconscious. It forced the public to confront the uncomfortable truth that many of our actions are driven by forces we cannot readily articulate. The episode, while damaging to Freud's reputation in some circles, cemented his role as a cultural lightning rod, a figure whose ideas would be debated in salons, courts, and lecture halls for decades to come. Freud's structural model has also been re-examined through the lens of modern attachment theory. John Bowlby's work on secure and insecure attachment parallels the ego's capacity to form stable internal representations of self and other. A child with a secure attachment develops an ego that trusts reality and can negotiate between id impulses and superego demands without excessive anxiety. In contrast, an insecurely attached child may experience a hyperactive superego, overly punitive, or an under-regulated id, impulsive behavior, leading to neurotic patterns that Freud would describe as fixation or repression. This synthesis shows how Freud's early insights about internal conflict anticipate later, empirically grounded theories of relational development. In terms of empirical validation, modern researchers have attempted to operationalize Freud's constructs. For instance, the id, ego, and superego inventory, IESI, developed in the 1990s attempts to measure individuals' tendencies toward instinctual drives, reality testing, and moral conscience. While the instrument has faced criticism for its reliance on self-report and its indirect mapping onto Freud's abstract concepts, it illustrates a continued interest in quantifying the structural model. Moreover, neuroimaging studies have identified brain regions that correspond loosely to Freudian agencies. The limbic system, amygdala, nucleus accumbens, aligns with the id's emotional and reward circuitry. The prefrontal cortex, especially the dorsolateral region, mirrors the ego's executive functions, and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, involved in moral judgment, can be likened to the superego. Though these correlations are far from definitive, they offer a bridge between psychoanalytic theory and contemporary neuroscience. The psychosexual stages, too, have found echoes in modern developmental psychology. Erik Erikson's 8 stages of psychosocial development, for example, retain the notion that each phase presents a central conflict that must be resolved for healthy growth. Erikson's trust versus mistrust infancy can be seen as an elaboration of the oral stage's need for nourishment and security, while his autonomy versus shame and doubt, early childhood, mirrors the anal stage's focus on control and independence. By reframing Freud's sexual focus into broader psychosocial tasks, Erikson preserved the structural insight that early experiences shape later personality, while moving away from the strict sexual determinism that has drawn much criticism. Karen Horney's reinterpretation of Freud's theory of neurosis further illustrates the adaptability of his ideas. She argued that neurotic needs, such as the need for affection, power, or achievement, stem from basic anxiety caused by interpersonal relationships, not from repressed sexual energy. In her view, the superego is not an internalized parental authority, but a self-ideal constructed from cultural expectations. Horney's emphasis on cultural and relational factors expands Freud's model, showing that the same structural dynamics can be reframed to address gender, social class, and cultural context. Ernest Jones, meanwhile, defended the core of Freud's developmental stages, asserting that the sequential nature of the psychosexual stages is evident in the clinical material, and each stage carries a distinct set of fixations that manifest in adult behavior. Jones's scholarship, based on meticulous case studies, provided a bulwark against the rising tide of behaviorism, reminding the academic community that the mind's internal life, though difficult to measure, remains a crucial domain of inquiry. The behaviorist critique, articulated by Watson and Skinner, posits that all human behavior can be explained through conditioning without invoking unconscious motives. They argued that the id, ego, and superego are unfalsifiable constructs, lacking empirical support. Skinner's operant conditioning paradigm, with its focus on reinforcement schedules, suggests that what Freud interpreted as a repressed desire could instead be a habit formed through repeated reward and punishment. For instance, a smoker's habit may be reinforced by the immediate relief of nicotine, rather than by an unconscious oral fixation. While behaviorism succeeded in establishing rigorous experimental methods, it also left unanswered the richness of inner experience that Freud sought to articulate. Modern cognitive critiques, such as those offered by Kahneman, add another layer of skepticism. Kahneman's dual-process model explains many of the same phenomena Freud attributed to unconscious conflict, biases, heuristics, and irrational choices through the interaction of fast, automatic processing, System 1, and slow, deliberative reasoning, System 2. In this framework, the id resembles System 1's impulsive drives, while the ego aligns with System 2's reflective capacities. The superego, however, is less clearly mapped. It could be seen as the internalized norms that shape System 2's criteria for rational decision-making. Yet, Kahneman's model is grounded in experimental data and statistical analysis, contrasting with Freud's reliance on case narratives and introspection. This cognitive perspective challenges the necessity of a tripartite psychic agency, proposing instead that mental shortcuts and information processing constraints account for much of human error and self-deception. Despite these critiques, Freud's legacy endures because his model provides a narrative scaffolding that resonates with the human desire for story. The idea that we are each a battleground of competing forces, that our childhood experiences leave indelible marks, and that hidden motives can surface in dreams, slips of the tongue, or artistic creation. These insights continue to inform literature, film, and everyday self-reflection. The metaphor of the house with its basement, middle floor, and attic invites us to imagine our inner lives as layered, dynamic, and importantly, negotiable. In closing, let us revisit the central concepts one more time, weaving together the strands we have explored. The id, a reservoir of instinctual energy, seeks immediate gratification. The ego, the realistic mediator, navigates the external world while employing defenses such as repression, displacement, and sublimation. The superego, the internalized moral authority, imposes standards derived from caregivers and culture. These three agencies interact across the psychosexual stages: oral, anal, phallic, latency, genital, each stage offering a unique conflict that, if resolved, contributes to a balanced personality, and if not, may produce fixations that echo in adult behavior. Repression shields the conscious mind from painful material, displacement redirects affect to safer targets, and sublimation transforms raw drive into socially valued achievement. The Oedipus complex, a cornerstone of the phallic stage, illustrates how early relational dynamics shape the superego's moral voice. Historical moments, the 1909 letter to Fleece, the 1915 Miller courtroom drama, demonstrate how Freud's ideas have both provoked and inspired public discourse. Cross-referencing with Jung's archetypes, Adler's birth order theory, Erikson's psychosocial stages, and modern cognitive science reveals a tapestry of dialogue that continues to evolve. Behaviorist and cognitive critiques remind us to question, to test, and to refine, while psychoanalytic scholars like Ernest Jones and Karen Horney show us how to adapt Freud's insights to new cultural contexts. When we observe a smoker reaching for a cigarette, a meticulous planner obsessively aligning every document, a poet turning forbidden longing into verse, or a therapist guiding a patient through transference, we witness the living echo of Freud's structural model. These everyday scenes, illuminated by vivid metaphor and grounded in historical depth, invite us to reflect on the hidden architecture of our own minds. And perhaps, in listening to this narrative, we each become a little more attuned to the quiet negotiations taking place in the basement, on the middle floor, and in the attic of our inner house. The work of Sigmund Freud has become almost synonymous with the very idea of talking therapy, yet what most people remember are the striking headlines: dreams about flying, slips of the tongue, the famous couch. What lies behind those headlines is a carefully constructed clinical methodology, a set of techniques that Freud refined over decades, and that continue to echo in the practices of modern psychotherapy, even in the mindfulness-based approaches and narrative therapies of today. In this segment, we will walk step by step through the core of Freud's therapeutic toolbox: free association, dream interpretation, and the intensive case study, illustrating each with the stories of patients whose names have entered the lexicon of psychology. Anna O. Dora Little Hands, the Wolf Man, and the patient whose dream of Irma's injection still haunts the pages of the interpretation of dreams. We will also pause to consider the scientific controversy that has surrounded Freud's method from the very beginning, hearing the voice of Karl Popper's falsifiability critique, the concerns of contemporary qualitative researchers, and the counter-arguments that defend the richness of Freud's clinical narratives. Finally, we will glimpse two pivotal moments in Freud's own intellectual life: the 1909 split with his former collaborator Joseph Breuer over the seduction theory, and the 1913 publication of Totem and Taboo that sparked an interdisciplinary firestorm. By the end of this exploration, you should have a sense not only of how Freud's techniques were practiced, but also of why they remain a point of reference, debate, and reinterpretation in the landscape of modern mental health. Let us begin with the process that Freud regarded as the royal road to the unconscious, free association. In the simplest terms, free association invites the patient to say whatever comes to mind, without censorship, without editing, without trying to make sense of it. The therapist sits beside the patient, often with a notepad, and the patient is encouraged to let thoughts flow like a river, even if they seem trivial, absurd, or painful. The key is that the patient does not judge the content. The therapist does not intervene with leading questions. Instead, the therapist listens for slips, repetitions, and emotional tones that may betray an underlying conflict. Step 1, then, is the establishment of a safe, neutral setting. Freud famously wrote, "The analyst must be a neutral observer, a quiet mirror in which the patient may see his own thoughts reflected without distortion." In practice, this meant a quiet room, a couch positioned so the patient could turn away from the analyst's face, and an atmosphere that signaled that no judgment would follow any utterance. The therapist's neutrality is not indifference, it is a strategic openness that allows the patient's psychic material to surface. Step 2 is the invitation itself. The analyst asks in a calm voice, "Please tell me whatever comes to mind, even if it seems unimportant or unrelated." The patient may begin with a description of the weather, a memory of breakfast, a fleeting image of a childhood toy. The crucial point is that the patient does not stop to edit or to rationalize. Each thought is allowed to run its course. As Freud observed, what is not said is often more revealing than what is said. Step 3 involves the therapist's attentive listening, not to the logical sequence of the narrative, but to the emotional charge and the associative links. If a patient mentions a recent argument with a spouse, then suddenly mentions a childhood scene of a mother scolding a child for spilling milk, the analyst notes the possible symbolic resonance of authority, guilt, and loss. The therapist may make a brief, non-intrusive comment such as, "I notice a feeling of shame when you talk about that." This gentle highlighting encourages the patient to stay with the feeling rather than to move away from it. Step 4 is the identification of patterns. Over several sessions, the analyst begins to map recurring themes, perhaps an obsession with cleanliness, a recurring image of a locked door, a persistent feeling of being watched. These patterns, Freud argued, are the breadcrumbs that lead back to repressed wishes or traumatic memories. The analyst may say, "You have spoken many times about doors that won't open. I wonder what that might represent for you." Step 5 is the integration of insight. Once a latent content, a hidden wish, fear, or conflict has been identified, the analyst helps the patient to articulate it, to name it, and to understand how it has been influencing thoughts, dreams, and behaviors. The moment of naming is, for Freud, a therapeutic act of making the unconscious conscious. He wrote, "The first step towards a cure is the conscious acknowledgement of the unconscious conflict." To see this process in action, we can turn to the early case that set the stage for Freud's method. The patient known as Anna O., whose real name was Bertha Pappenheim. Although the case is technically attributed to Joseph Breuer, it profoundly influenced Freud's own technique. Anna O. suffered from a constellation of symptoms: paralysis of the limbs, visual disturbances, and a persistent sense of anxiety. Breuer encouraged her to talk about her symptoms while he listened, and she began to recount vivid memories and fantasies. In what Breuer later described as the talking cure, Anna O. would spontaneously utter phrases such as, "It is my mother who is making me sick," and then, after a pause, "I cannot remember." The crucial moment came when she began to speak, without any prompting, about a painful episode from her childhood. A night when she was left alone in a dark house while her mother attended a social gathering. The recollection of that night and the associated feelings of abandonment seemed to alleviate the paralysis she had been experiencing. In Freud's later writings, he emphasized that this cathartic release of repressed material was the essence of the therapeutic process. Freud adapted this insight into the more systematic free association technique. Whereas Breuer's sessions were more spontaneous, Freud introduced a structured setting, a consistent schedule, and a rigorous analytic stance. He also paired free association with another cornerstone of his method, dream interpretation. Dreams, for Freud, were not random nocturnal fantasies, but the disguised fulfillment of repressed wishes. In The Interpretation of Dreams, 1900, he famously declared, "The interpretation of dreams is the royal road to a knowledge of the unconscious activities of the mind." The dream work involves moving from the manifest content, the literal storyline of the dream, to the latent content, the hidden wish or conflict that the dream disguises. Freud identified several mechanisms of disguise: condensation, displacement, symbolization, and secondary revision. By tracing these mechanisms, the analyst can reconstruct the latent meaning. Let us examine two of Freud's most famous dream analyses. The first is the Irma's injection dream, recorded in the interpretation of dreams as part of Freud's own personal dream. In the dream, Freud sees his patient Irma, a young woman he had treated for a nervous disorder, lying in a hospital bed, suffering from a severe infection caused by a contaminated injection. The dream is vivid. The doctor's hands are stained, the air smells of antiseptic, and Irma's skin is mottled. Freud awakens, writes down the dream, and begins the analytic work. The manifest content is straightforward, a medical mishap. The latent content, however, reveals Freud's own feelings of guilt and responsibility toward his patients. Freud notes that in his waking life, Irma's case had been a source of professional anxiety. He had felt uncertain about the efficacy of his treatment and feared that he might have caused harm. The dream's focus on a contaminated injection becomes a symbolic representation of Freud's fear that his therapeutic injections, the ideas he introduced into the patient's psyche, might be contaminated by his own unresolved conflicts. The analysis proceeds by identifying the condensation of several elements. The doctor's hands, the infection, the hospital setting, all condense Freud's own sense of professional inadequacy and the fear of being blamed for a patient's deterioration. As Freud wrote in the case notes, the dream shows how the analyst's own unconscious guilt can be projected onto the patient, and how the therapeutic relationship becomes a mirror for the analyst's own anxieties. The second dream analysis is that of the Wolf Man, the pseudonym for Sergei Pankajev, a young Viennese aristocrat who came to Freud in 1910. The Wolf Man reported a recurring dream in which he stood in a forest at night, looking up at a tree, and saw a pack of wolves staring at him from the branches. The wolves seemed both terrifying and oddly alluring. Freud's interpretation, following his method, began by identifying the manifest content, the forest, the tree, the wolves. He then traced the symbolism. The tree represented the father figure, the wolves represented the primal, animalistic drives, and the darkness of the forest symbolized the unconscious. The latent content, Freud concluded, was a repressed memory of witnessing his parents' sexual intercourse as a child, an event that had been seduced into his unconscious and now resurfaced as a fearful image of predatory wolves. Freud wrote, "The wolves are the fantasies of the child who, in his earliest sexual awareness, feels both fascination and terror at the sight of the parental union." This analysis is often cited as a classic illustration of how a seemingly fantastical dream can be unpacked to reveal deep-seated psychosexual conflict. Both dream analyses demonstrate the systematic way Freud moved from surface narrative to hidden meaning, employing the tools of free association to explore the associations the patient had with the dream images. In practice, after a patient reports a dream, the analyst asks the patient to free associate on every element. What does the tree remind you of? What feelings arise when you think of wolves? The patient's responses, often surprising and tangential, provide the raw material for decoding the latent content. Having illustrated the two core techniques, free association and dream interpretation, we now turn to the case study methodology that underlies much of Freud's published work. Freud's case histories are not mere anecdotes. They are detailed, longitudinal observations that combine the patient's narrative, the analyst's notes, and the interpretive commentary. The case study in Freud's hands is a laboratory where theory and data meet, yet this approach has been a lightning rod for criticism, especially from philosophers of science and contemporary qualitative scholars. Karl Popper, the Austrian-British philosopher of science, famously attacked psychoanalysis in his 1959 book The Logic of Scientific Discovery. Popper argued that a theory must be falsifiable, capable of being tested and potentially disproven, to be considered scientific. He wrote, "A theory which is not falsifiable is not scientific." In his view, Freud's psychoanalytic theory was a pseudoscience because its explanatory power could accommodate any possible observation. If a patient displayed anxiety, the analyst could interpret it as a manifestation of repressed sexual desire. If the patient displayed depression, the analyst could reinterpret it as a loss of a loved object. Because the theory was so flexible, it could never be refuted. Contemporary qualitative researchers have taken a different angle. Scholars such as Jonathan Potter and Michael Agar have praised the depth and richness of Freud's case narratives, arguing that they offer a form of interpretive validity that quantitative methods cannot capture. They suggest that the value of a case study lies not in its generalizability, but in its ability to illuminate the lived experience of the subject, to reveal the meanings that participants assign to their own actions and thoughts. In this view, Freud's detailed transcripts of free association sessions are akin to ethnographic field notes, providing a window into the internal world of the patient. Two counter-arguments often surface in this debate. The first is the claim that Freud's cases are merely anecdotal, lacking the statistical power and control groups that modern clinical trials demand. Critics point out that the sample sizes are tiny, often a single patient, and that the outcomes are not measured with standardized scales. They argue that without replication, the findings cannot be considered reliable evidence for the efficacy of psychoanalysis. The second counter-argument concerns cultural bias. Freud's interpretive framework was rooted in early 20th century Viennese middle-class norms, with a heavy emphasis on sexual repression, Oedipal conflict, and patriarchal family structures. Critics such as feminist theorist Karen Horney and later cultural psychologists have argued that Freud projected his own cultural assumptions onto his patients, interpreting their narratives through a lens that privileged Western notions of sexuality and family. Horney, for example, wrote, "The neurosis of a woman is not a simple mirror of male neurosis. It has its own cultural and social origins." This critique suggests that Freud's interpretations may have been more reflective of his own worldview than of the patient's lived realities. To appreciate how these criticisms emerged, we need to revisit two pivotal moments in Freud's own intellectual trajectory. The first is the 1909 split with Joseph Breuer over the seduction theory. In the early 1890s, Freud, working with Breuer, had hypothesized that hysteria stemmed from actual sexual abuse, what he called seduction. However, by 1909, after years of clinical work and personal reflection, Freud abandoned the seduction theory, arguing instead that the memories of sexual abuse were often fantasies or unconscious wishes, not necessarily real events. This shift caused a rift with Breuer, who remained convinced that the traumatic reality of sexual abuse was central to hysteria. The split was not merely a personal disagreement. It marked a turning point in psychoanalytic theory, moving from a literal to a symbolic understanding of sexual content. Freud's own letter to Breuer, dated May 1909, reads, "I can no longer accept the hypothesis that all neuroses arise from a single historical fact. The mind constructs its own narratives, and it is these narratives that we must uncover." The controversy surrounding the seduction theory illustrates how Freud's methodology was both a product of and a reaction to the cultural and scientific context of his time. The second moment is the 1913 publication of Totem and Taboo, a work that attempted to synthesize psychoanalysis with anthropology, archaeology, and the emerging field of comparative religion. In this book, Freud proposed that the origins of civilization could be traced to a primal horde in which a dominant male killed the father figure and established a totemic system. He argued that the Oedipus complex was not merely an individual developmental stage, but a collective memory of this ancient murder. The book provoked fierce debate among anthropologists such as Franz Boas and later, the structuralist Claude Lévi-Strauss. Boas wrote, "Freud's attempt to universalize the Oedipus complex across cultures is a dangerous reductionism that ignores the diversity of social organization." Yet the interdisciplinary ambition of Totem and Taboo also opened a dialogue between psychoanalysis and the social sciences, a dialogue that continues today in fields such as cultural psychiatry and narrative therapy. Returning to the clinical practice, let us consider how Freud's techniques have been reinterpreted in contemporary therapeutic modalities. Mindfulness-based therapies, for example, share with free association an emphasis on observing mental content without judgment. In mindfulness, a client is invited to notice thoughts, feelings, and bodily sensations as they arise, labeling them gently, thinking, worrying, pain, and letting them pass. This non-reactive stance parallels the analyst's request for the patient to say whatever comes to mind. The difference lies in the purpose. Mindfulness seeks to cultivate present-moment awareness and reduce reactivity, while Freud's free association aims to uncover hidden, often unconscious, conflicts. Nevertheless, both approaches recognize the therapeutic value of allowing mental material to surface unfiltered. Narrative psychology also draws heavily from Freud's case study tradition, though it reframes the therapeutic goal. Narrative therapists encourage clients to reauthor their life stories, to externalize problems, and to identify alternative, more empowering narratives. This process resembles Freud's integration phase, where the analyst helps the patient name and reinterpret the latent content of their fantasies and dreams. However, narrative therapy explicitly foregrounds the socio-cultural context of the story, addressing the very cultural bias that critics have highlighted in Freud's work. By situating personal narratives within broader cultural discourses, narrative therapy attempts to balance the individual's inner world with the external structures that shape it. To see these connections in action, imagine a modern therapist who, after a session of mindful breathing, invites a client to free associate about a recurring nightmare of being chased by a faceless figure. The client describes the figure as a shadow of my mother, and the therapist notes the emotional intensity. Drawing on Freud's dream work, the therapist might ask the client to explore the symbolism of the shadow, the mother, and the act of being pursued. At the same time, the therapist might employ narrative techniques, encouraging the client to view the shadow not as an immutable destiny, but as a story element that can be rewritten. Perhaps the shadow becomes a guide rather than a pursuer. In this hybrid approach, the therapist honors the depth of the unconscious while also acknowledging the client's agency in cultural context. Let us return now to the concrete steps of free association, this time through the lens of the Dora case, which illustrates both the power and the pitfalls of Freud's method. In 1905, Freud began treating a 17-year-old student, pseudonymously named Dora, who presented with a range of psychosomatic symptoms: aphonia, coughing, and nervousness. During the sessions, Freud asked Dora to speak freely about whatever came to mind. She spoke about her family, her school, and a series of mysterious, hissing sounds that she claimed she heard in the house. As she free associated, she repeatedly mentioned her father's friend, Herr K., and a secret that seemed to hover just out of reach. Freud interpreted these fragments as evidence of an unconscious sexual desire for Herr K., combined with a repressed memory of an attempted seduction. He wrote, "The hissing is the auditory symbol of the suppressed sexual desire that Dora cannot consciously articulate." However, Dora abruptly terminated therapy after a few weeks, feeling that Freud had misunderstood her and was imposing his own fantasies upon her narrative. In a later letter to Freud, she wrote, "You have taken my words and turned them into a story that is not mine." This case highlights a central tension in Freud's method. The analyst's interpretive authority can sometimes eclipse the patient's own sense of meaning. A later case, that of Little Hans, offers another illustration of the free association and dream analysis blend. Little Hans, a 5-year-old boy, developed an intense fear of horses after witnessing a horse stumble near his home. Freud, through Hans's mother, collected the child's spontaneous remarks, drawings, and fantasies. Hans would say, "The horse is big, it has a big mouth," and would later draw a horse with a gaping mouth. Freud interpreted this as a symbolic expression of the Oedipus complex. The horse represented the father, the fear of being eaten reflected the child's castration anxiety. The latent content, according to Freud, was Hans's unconscious desire for his mother and fear of losing the father's love. The free association element here is mediated through the mother's reports, but the principle remains. The analyst follows the chain of associations, horse, mouth, fear, to uncover the underlying conflict. Both Dora and Little Hans demonstrate how Freud's method relied on a collaborative reconstruction of meaning, yet also how the analyst's theoretical lens could shape the interpretation in ways that later critics deem overly deterministic. The counter-argument that Freud's cases are anecdotal gains traction when we consider that the outcomes were not measured with systematic pre- and post-treatment scales. Nonetheless, proponents argue that the depth of insight achieved, insights that often persisted for decades in the patient's lives, offers a different kind of evidence, one rooted in phenomenological richness rather than statistical significance. Now let us revisit the two dream analyses, but this time we will follow the exact free association process that Freud would have used. Imagine Freud sitting across from the wolf man, listening as Sergei describes the wolves perched in the tree. Freud would ask, "When you think of the wolves, what does that remind you of?" Sergei might answer, "I think of my father's face, stern and unapproachable." The analyst would note the condensation of the wolf's predatory nature with the father figure. Next, Freud would ask, "What does the tree mean to you?" Sergei might say, "A tree is something that stands tall, like my mother, always watching." The analyst would then explore the displacement of parental figures onto natural symbols. Finally, Freud would probe the emotional tone. "How do you feel when you see the wolves?" Sergei might respond, "I feel frightened, but also a strange curiosity." This ambivalence becomes a clue to the latent wish, the yearning for a forbidden union, mixed with the fear of punishment. By tracing each associative step, Freud believed he could reconstruct the hidden narrative of the patient's early sexual awareness. Similarly, in the Irma's injection dream, Freud would have asked Irma, or rather the analyst's own self, to free associate on each element. The hospital, the injection, the contamination, the doctor's hands. The analyst would note that the hospital represents a place of healing, yet also a place of vulnerability. The injection symbolizes a forced introduction of something foreign, the contamination evokes guilt. Each of these associations, when linked to the analyst's personal history, perhaps a childhood experience of being forced to take medicine, provides the latent content. the unconscious fear that his therapeutic interventions might cause harm, reflecting a deeper anxiety about the limits of his authority. The meticulousness of this process is what made Freud's case studies both compelling and controversial. On the one hand, the narrative depth offers a vivid portrait of the inner life of a patient, a portrait that continues to inspire literature, film, and art. On the other hand, the lack of external verification, no double-blind controls, no replication, leaves the scientific community divided. Karl Popper's critique remains a touchstone. If a theory can be adapted to explain any outcome, it loses its predictive power. Yet many contemporary scholars argue that the very flexibility of psychoanalytic theory is its strength, allowing it to accommodate the complexity of human experience that rigid quantitative models often miss. In recent decades, qualitative researchers have attempted to bridge this divide by employing methods such as grounded theory, phenomenological analysis, and narrative inquiry. They treat Freud's case notes as primary data, coding the transcripts for themes, patterns, and contradictions, much as a sociologist might analyze interview data. This approach respects the richness of the original material while subjecting it to systematic analysis. For instance, a 2019 study published in Qualitative Psychology re-examined the DORA transcripts, identifying themes of power dynamics, gendered expectations, and the patient's own agency, thereby offering a reinterpretation that acknowledges both Freud's insights and his cultural blind spots. The question then becomes, what can contemporary clinicians learn from Freud's methodology, given its historical baggage? First, the practice of encouraging patients to speak without censorship remains a cornerstone of many therapeutic modalities. Whether in psychodynamic therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, or humanistic approaches, the therapist often asks, "What's on your mind right now?" The aim is to surface material that may be influencing the client's current distress. Second, the attention to symbolic meaning, whether in dreams, fantasies, or everyday metaphors, continues to inform therapies that address meaning-making, such as meaning-centered psychotherapy and existential therapy. Third, the case study format, while not a substitute for randomized controlled trials, offers a valuable pedagogical tool. Training programs still assign students to write detailed case formulations, encouraging them to integrate observation, theory, and reflective practice. Finally, let us consider how Freud's legacy intersects with modern mindfulness and narrative practices. In mindfulness, the therapist guides the client to notice thoughts as they arise, labeling them as thinking, remembering, or worrying, much like Freud asked his patients to observe the flow of associations. The difference lies in the endpoint. Mindfulness aims to cultivate acceptance and reduce identification with thoughts, whereas Freud sought to transform the content of those thoughts by bringing repressed material into consciousness. Yet both share the belief that unexamined mental material can influence affect and behavior. Narrative therapy, on the other hand, invites clients to externalize problems. The depression is not you. It is a story you have been told. This echoes Freud's technique of separating the symptom from the self, allowing the patient to view the symptom as a manifestation of an underlying conflict rather than an inherent flaw. Moreover, narrative therapy explicitly addresses cultural narratives, responding to the criticism that Freud's interpretations were culturally myopic. By inviting clients to examine the societal scripts that shape their self-story, narrative therapy offers a corrective to the one-size-fits-all Oedipal model. In sum, the clinical methodology that Freud pioneered, free association, dream interpretation, and intensive case study, remains a foundational chapter in the history of psychotherapy. The step-by-step process of free association, illustrated by the early work with Anna O., the tragic unraveling of Dora, and the developmental insights of Little Hands, shows how a disciplined listening stance can uncover hidden emotional currents. The dream analyses of Irma's injection and the Wolf Man reveal the intricate mechanisms by which the unconscious disguises wishes, and how careful associative work can peel back those disguises. The scientific controversy, from Popper's falsifiability objection to contemporary qualitative defenses, reminds us that the standards by which we judge therapeutic knowledge evolve over time. The counter-arguments, anecdotal nature and cultural bias, challenge us to refine our methods, to incorporate rigorous measurement while honoring the depth of lived experience. The historical anecdotes of Freud's split with Breuer over the seduction theory, and the interdisciplinary uproar sparked by Totem and Taboo illustrate how Freud's ideas both reflected and reshaped the intellectual currents of his era. And yet perhaps the most enduring lesson is the humility embedded in the practice itself. Freud wrote, "Being entirely honest with oneself is a good exercise." In the therapeutic encounter, both analyst and patient embark on a joint venture of honesty, of allowing thoughts to surface, of naming the nameless, of confronting the shadows that linger behind everyday consciousness. Whether we stand in a Viennese consulting room in 1909 or a modern clinic employing mindfulness and narrative techniques, the invitation remains the same: to speak, to listen, and to discover what lies beneath. As we close this exploration of Freud's clinical methodology, remember that the journey into the mind is never a straight line, but a winding path of associations, symbols, and stories, each waiting to be heard, each waiting to be understood. Imagine, for a moment, the echo of a single idea reverberating through the corridors of an entire century. When Sigmund Freud first whispered the language of the unconscious into the salons of Vienna, he did not merely open a new chapter in psychology. He set in motion a ripple that would lap against the shores of literature, paint, cinema, and philosophy. In this segment, we will follow that ripple, tracing its path from the cramped consulting rooms of the early 20th century neurologists to the bright canvases of surrealist painters, the darkened theaters of Shakespearean tragedy, and the restless minds of existential philosophers. We will hear the laughter of Parisian intellectuals in the 1920s, feel the heat of the Nazi book burnings in the 1930s, and listen to the dissenting voices of feminists and post-structuralists who turned Freud's mirror upon itself. All of this, we shall see, is not a peripheral footnote but a central thread that continues to shape how we understand desire, identity, and the very act of interpreting art. Let us begin with a literary example that has become almost a rite of passage for any student of cultural theory: the Freudian reading of Shakespeare's Hamlet. In the early 1920s, the Austrian psychoanalyst Ernest Jones, a close confidant of Freud, published an essay that proposed Hamlet's hesitation to avenge his father's murder could be understood as a manifestation of the Oedipus complex. According to Freud, the Oedipus complex is the primal psychic conflict in which a child feels both desire for the opposite sex parent and rivalry toward the same sex parent. In Hamlet's case, the young prince's obsession with his mother, Gertrude, and his ambivalence toward his uncle-turned-king, Claudius, can be read as an unconscious reenactment of this ancient drama. Freud himself wrote in The Interpretation of Dreams, "The dream work is the royal road to a knowledge of the unconscious." When applied to Hamlet, the dream work becomes a metaphor for the play's soliloquies, each line a fleeting glimpse into the prince's hidden yearning and guilt. Consider the famous "to be or not to be" soliloquy. A Freudian reading might suggest that Hamlet's contemplation of death is not merely philosophical melancholy, but a disguised wish to escape the guilt of his unconscious desire for his mother. The line, "Thus conscience does make cowards of us all," can be heard as the superego, Freud's internalized moral authority, silencing the id's raw impulses. In this interpretation, the tragedy is not only political but also psychic, a stage upon which the forces of the unconscious play out in dramatic form. This reading, while compelling, is not without its critics, and we will return to those critiques later, but its endurance in academic curricula demonstrates how Freud's concepts have become a lens through which we re-examine even the most canonical works of Western literature. Moving from the page to the canvas, we encounter another vivid illustration of Freud's cultural penetration: the Surrealist movement, and in particular Salvador Dali's iconic painting, The Persistence of Memory. When Dali unveiled his melting clocks in 1931, he was not merely playing with visual paradoxes. He was visualizing the fluidity of time as experienced in the unconscious mind. Surrealists gathered around André Breton's manifesto declared that the marvelous is the true. They sought to liberate the imagination from the constraints of rationality, a project that resonated deeply with Freud's assertion that the ego is not master in its own house. The soft, dripping watches can be read as a pictorial representation of Freud's concept of psychic time. The way repressed memories can stretch and distort the present, much as the clocks stretch across a barren landscape. Dali himself acknowledged Freud's influence, noting in a 1935 interview that "my work is a dream of the unconscious, a visual Freudian slipstream." The painting's barren desert, the strange ant-infested pocket watch, and the amorphous figure draped over a branch all evoke the uncanny, Freud's term for that unsettling feeling when the familiar becomes strangely unfamiliar. The ant, a recurring motif in Dali's work, can be seen as a symbol of decay, echoing Freud's idea that repressed thoughts gnaw at the psyche like insects. In this way, the canvas becomes a laboratory where the theories of the Viennese doctor are tested, stretched, and transformed into visual poetry. These two examples, Shakespeare's tragic prince and Dali's melting clocks, are not isolated curiosities. They belong to a broader cultural phenomenon that unfolded in the Roaring Twenties when Freud's ideas surged through the intellectual salons of Paris. Picture a dimly lit drawing room in the Hôtel de Sully, where the poet Paul Valéry, the painter Pablo Picasso, and the writer André Gide gathered around a small table, a bottle of champagne bubbling in the background. A young, eager psychoanalyst, none other than Jacques Lacan, then a medical student, offered a brief lecture on the talking cure. The room erupted in a mixture of fascination and skepticism. As Valéry later recalled in his diary, Freud's words are like a key that opens a hidden door, yet the room beyond is both terrifying and exhilarating. The excitement was palpable. The French press coined the term Freudомanie, and best-selling pamphlets titled La Psychanalyse pour tous sold out within weeks. The frenzy was not confined to Paris. Across the Atlantic, the American literary scene was equally enraptured. In 1919, the poet T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land was hailed as a modernist masterpiece precisely because of its fragmented, dream-like quality, a quality that critics linked to Freudian notions of the unconscious. The phrase, the mind's eye, which appears repeatedly in Eliot's poetry, was taken as a direct nod to the psychical apparatus that Freud described. In these cultural crucibles, Freud's theories became a shared vocabulary, a shorthand for describing the hidden currents that shape human creativity. Yet as the influence spread, so did resistance. By the late 1930s, a darker chapter unfolded in the very same Europe that had once celebrated Freud. The rise of National Socialism brought with it an aggressive campaign to eradicate what the Nazis deemed degenerate ideas. In 1933, on the infamous day of the book burnings in Berlin, a pile of German translations of Freud's works, the interpretation of dreams, totem and taboo, civilization and its discontents, was set alight. Witnesses reported that the flames seemed to lick the edges of the intellectual world, as if trying to erase a whole mode of thinking. In a letter to his sister, Freud wrote, "The fire that burns my books also burns the very notion of a free mind." The destruction was both literal and symbolic, a stark reminder that ideas, no matter how powerful, are vulnerable to political forces. The fire, however, could not extinguish the intellectual embers that had already been sparked. In the post-war era, a new generation of philosophers confronted Freud's legacy, often with a mixture of admiration and repudiation. Existentialists such as Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, who foregrounded human freedom and responsibility, found Freud's deterministic model of the psyche unsettling. Sartre famously declared, "Man is condemned to be free," emphasizing that consciousness is not bound by unconscious drives but by the weight of choice. In his essay, Existentialism is a Humanism, Sartre directly addressed Freud, writing, "We may acknowledge the unconscious, but we must not surrender the possibility of authentic self-creation to it." Camus, too, in The Myth of Sisyphus, dismissed the idea that our suffering could be reduced to a biological or psychic compulsion, insisting instead that the absurd arises from the clash between our yearning for meaning and a silent universe. These existential critiques were not merely academic quibbles, they reflected a profound philosophical tension between determinism and freedom. While Freud posited that much of our behavior is guided by repressed wishes and childhood experiences, what he called the unconscious determinants of the psychic life, the existentialists argued that such a view undermines moral responsibility. In a famous correspondence, Sartre wrote to Freud's disciple Jacques Lacan, "If the unconscious determines us, then the notion of freedom becomes a myth. If we are free, the unconscious must be a metaphor, not a law." This dialogue, real or imagined, encapsulated the intellectual crossroads at which 20th century thought stood. The conversation did not end there. Jacques Lacan, who would later become one of Freud's most controversial interpreters, reimagined the unconscious not as a repository of repressed wishes, but as a structure of language. In his seminal lecture, The Mirror Stage is Formative of the Eye Function, Lacan asserted, "The unconscious is structured like a language." By shifting the focus from biological drives to symbolic order, Lacan opened a new pathway for literary theory, film studies, and semiotics. The mirror stage, which describes a child's first recognition of its own image, became a metaphor for the formation of identity in modern media. When we watch a film noir protagonist gaze into a rain-slicked window, we are witnessing a visual echo of Lacan's mirror stage, a moment where the character confronts a fragmented self, much as a child confronts its reflection. Beyond Lacan, the Freudian lineage branched further into the work of Wilfred Bion, whose theories of group dynamics and container-contained relationships extended the psychoanalytic lens into the realm of social institutions. Bion's idea that a group functions like a psychic container, absorbing and processing emotional anxieties, can be seen in the way a theater troupe collectively navigates the tension between the director's vision and the actor's unconscious impulses. In his book Experiences in Groups, Bion wrote, "The group is a living organism that can think, feel, and even dream." This perspective has been applied to everything from corporate boardrooms to political movements, showing that Freud's initial focus on the individual psyche has blossomed into a framework for understanding collective behavior. Yet as the Freudian tree grew, so did the branches of critique. Feminist scholars were among the most vocal opponents of Freud's gendered assumptions. Luce Irigaray, in her essay Speculum of the Other Woman, argued that Freud's Oedipus complex is fundamentally phallocentric, reducing women to mere objects of male desire. She wrote, "The unconscious is not a universal structure but a gendered one, inscribed with the patriarchal law." Betty Friedan, in The Feminine Mystique, contended that Freud's portrayal of women's penis envy reinforced a cultural narrative that kept women in domestic confinement. Friedan's critique was not simply about a theoretical error. It was a call to recognize how psychoanalytic language could be weaponized to justify social inequality. These feminist interventions forced a re-examination of the universality claimed by early psychoanalysis and opened the door for more nuanced, intersectional approaches to the study of desire. Parallel to feminist critiques, post-structuralist thinkers like Jacques Derrida offered a deconstructive reading of Freud that turned the psychoanalytic method on its head. In Freud and the Scene of Writing, Derrida suggested that the very act of interpretation, of uncovering the hidden meaning behind a dream or slip of the tongue, mirrors the endless play of signifiers that Derrida would later describe as difference. He wrote, "The unconscious is not a hidden truth awaiting discovery. It is a text that forever defers its own meaning." By treating the unconscious as an endless chain of signification, Derrida challenged the idea that psychoanalysis could ever arrive at a final, authoritative reading. This perspective resonated with literary theorists who began to view texts as sites of perpetual reinterpretation rather than fixed vessels of authorial intent. These counterarguments, while challenging, do not diminish Freud's cultural impact, rather they enrich it. They demonstrate that Freud's ideas have become a living conversation, one that is continually reshaped by new perspectives. The feminist insistence on gendered analysis, the post-structuralist emphasis on textual fluidity, and the existentialist focus on freedom have all forced Freud's original concepts to evolve, adapt, and sometimes even fracture. The result is a vibrant intellectual ecosystem in which Freud's legacy is both celebrated and contested. To see how this ecosystem functions in practice, let us return to the world of cinema. The 1949 film The Third Man by Carol Reed, starring Orson Welles, is often cited as a cinematic embodiment of Freudian tension. The film's shadowy streets of post-war Vienna, the recurring motif of the broken watch, and the ambiguous morality of the protagonist, Harry Lime, echo the Freudian themes of repression, the return of the repressed, and the uncanny. In a 1950 essay, the film critic André Bazin wrote, "The third man is a dream of the city, a subconscious projection of the trauma of war, rendered in chiaroscuro." The watch, much like Dali's melting clocks, becomes a symbol of time's distortion under the weight of unresolved psychic conflict. Another striking example comes from the realm of popular music. The Beatles' 1965 song, Tomorrow Never Knows, inspired by Timothy Leary's interpretation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead and by the psychedelic experience, also carries a Freudian undertone. John Lennon's lyric, "Turn off your mind, relax and float downstream," can be heard as an invitation to bypass the ego's defenses and access the unconscious stream. The song's use of tape loops and reversed sounds creates a sonic landscape that resembles the free association technique Freud employed in his clinical sessions. In this way, even the avant-garde of rock music found a language that resonated with psychoanalytic concepts, further testifying to the breadth of Freud's cultural diffusion. The influence of Freud also seeped into the visual language of advertising. In the 1950s, the American advertising agency J. Walter Thompson began to employ psychoanalytic research to tap into consumers' unconscious desires. The famous Marlboro Man campaign, for instance, was designed to evoke a primal sense of rugged masculinity, a symbolic substitution for the repressed need for dominance and freedom. As the copywriter James Webb famously noted, "We are not selling cigarettes, we are selling an unconscious fantasy of power." This strategic manipulation of the unconscious, while ethically questionable, illustrates how Freud's theories were co-opted to shape not only art but also commerce. All these cultural manifestations, literary criticism, surrealist painting, cinema, popular music, and advertising, share a common thread. They treat the unconscious not as a private, clinical phenomenon but as a public, collective resource. The notion that hidden desires can be read, visualized, and even commodified transformed the way societies understand themselves. It also gave rise to a new kind of cultural literacy, where a viewer or reader is expected to recognize the Freudian slip, the symbolic dream, or the latent content hidden beneath the surface. But what does this mean for us today, in an era dominated by digital media and neuroscientific breakthroughs? Contemporary thinkers such as Slavoj Žižek have argued that Freud's insights remain vital precisely because they reveal the ideological underpinnings of our everyday experiences. Žižek, in his book The Sublime Object of Ideology, writes, "The unconscious is the engine of ideology. It is what makes the social order appear natural." In the age of algorithms that predict our preferences, the Freudian idea that we are driven by forces we do not consciously control feels eerily prescient. The modern filter bubble can be seen as a digital analog of the repression defense mechanism, where unwanted information is pushed out of our conscious awareness, only to resurface later in unexpected ways. Neuroscience, too, has begun to speak a language that echoes Freud's early hypotheses. Studies on the default mode network, a set of brain regions active during mind-wandering and self-referential thought, suggest that the brain indeed generates spontaneous narratives when not engaged in goal-directed activity. Some scholars interpret this as a neural correlate of the unconscious mind's free association. While contemporary scientists are cautious about equating neural activity with Freudian constructs, the dialogue between psychoanalysis and neuroscience illustrates the enduring relevance of Freud's core intuition, that much of human experience operates beneath the surface of conscious awareness. In reflecting upon this vast cultural tapestry, it is useful to revisit the words Freud himself offered at the close of The Future of an Illusion, where he warned, "We are not only a product of our environment, but also of the unconscious forces that shape that environment." The paradox here is striking. The environment shapes us, yet we, through our unconscious drives, shape the environment in return. This dialectic is precisely what we observe in the way Freud's ideas have been absorbed, transformed, and sometimes resisted across disciplines. Let us now consider the ongoing dialogue between Freud and Lacan once more, this time focusing on how Lacan reinterpreted the Oedipus complex through the prism of language. Lacan argued that the child's entry into the symbolic order, into language itself, constitutes the moment of the name of the father, a metaphorical representation of law and prohibition. In this view, the Oedipal conflict is less about literal desire for the mother and more about the child's confrontation with the limits of language and social norm. This shift has profound implications for literary criticism. When we read Hamlet through a Lacanian lens, we might focus less on the prince's sexual desire for Gertrude and more on his struggle to articulate his desire within the constraints of courtly speech. The madness that Hamlet feigns becomes a performance of the lack inherent in language, a lack that can never be fully resolved. Similarly, Bien's concept of containment offers a fresh perspective on artistic creation. The artist, in Bien's terms, acts as a container for raw emotional material, transforming it into a work that can be shared with an audience. Dali's melting clocks, for instance, can be seen as the artist's way of containing the anxiety of temporal decay and presenting it in a form that the viewer can digest. The audience, in turn, becomes a secondary container, processing the emotional content and perhaps integrating it into their own psychic life. This cyclical process of containment and transformation underscores how Freud's ideas have become tools for understanding not only individual pathology but also collective aesthetic experience. The narrative of Freud's cultural diffusion is incomplete without acknowledging the role of translation and adaptation. Freud wrote in German, but his ideas spread through French, English, Spanish, and countless other languages. Each translation carried with it subtle shifts in meaning, much like a dream that changes each time it is retold. The French translation of The Interpretation of Dreams by Georges Politzer, for example, emphasized the symbolic over the latent, thereby influencing French literary criticism to focus more on symbolic reading than on psychoanalytic decoding. In the English-speaking world, the popularization of Freud's ideas by figures such as Carl Jung and later by pop psychology authors softened some of Freud's more controversial claims, making them more palatable for a mass audience. This process of mediation illustrates how ideas are never static. They are always refracted through cultural lenses that reshape their impact. Returning to the historical anecdotes, the 1920s Freud craze in Paris salons was not merely a fleeting fashion. It was a moment when the boundaries between science, art, and philosophy blurred. The poet Paul Valéry, who initially dismissed Freud as a charlatan of the mind, later admitted in a letter to his friend that the notion of the unconscious has entered my poetry like a new pigment, altering the way I see the world. The painter Henry Matisse, too, reportedly kept a copy of the interpretation of dreams on his studio desk, consulting it whenever he struggled to capture the inner truth of his subjects. Even the mathematician and philosopher Henri Poincaré, known for his work on chaos theory, referenced Freud's idea of psychic determinism in a lecture on the unpredictability of complex systems. These anecdotes demonstrate that Freud's influence seeped into disciplines far beyond his own, creating a shared intellectual vocabulary that transcended traditional academic borders. The second anecdote, the Nazi book burnings, serves as a grim reminder that ideas can become targets of political oppression. The burning of Freud's works was part of a broader campaign to eradicate what the regime labeled Jewish intellectualism. Yet paradoxically, the very act of attempting to destroy Freud's writings amplified their mystique. In the post-war period, a new generation of scholars, including the French existentialist Simone de Beauvoir, revisited Freud with renewed vigor, interpreting his theories as both a symptom and a critique of the modern condition. De Beauvoir, in her essay *The Second Sex*, invoked Freud's concept of the penis envy not to endorse it, but to illustrate how patriarchal structures internalize themselves within the unconscious. This reclamation of Freud's ideas in the aftermath of their attempted annihilation underscores the resilience of intellectual thought. In the contemporary arena, we see the continued branching of Freudian thought in fields such as trauma studies. Scholars like Kathy Caruth have drawn on Freud's early work on trauma, particularly his essay *Beyond the Pleasure Principle*, to argue that trauma is not merely a past event but a present, recurring psychic imprint that resurfaces in the form of flashbacks and nightmares. Caruth writes, the trauma is not an object that has been taken away, but a return of the repressed that insists on being heard. This perspective has informed literary analyses of works ranging from Toni Morrison's Beloved to the cinema of David Lynch, whose films often depict characters haunted by inexplicable, recurring images that defy rational explanation. Meanwhile, the field of psychoanalytic literary criticism has expanded to incorporate post-colonial perspectives. Scholars such as Homi K. Babha have employed Freud's concept of the uncanny to explore how colonial subjects experience a sense of dislocation when confronted with the familiar turned strange. Babha writes, the uncanny is the space where the colonized subject recognizes the colonizer's culture as both familiar and alien, a psychic double bind. By applying Freudian concepts to the analysis of cultural hybridity, contemporary critics demonstrate the adaptability of Freud's framework to address new social realities. Even the realm of technology is not immune to Freudian analysis. In the burgeoning field of human-computer interaction, researchers have begun to explore the uncanny valley phenomenon, a term coined by roboticist Masahiro Mori, but whose conceptual roots lie in Freud's uncanny. The feeling of discomfort we experience when a robot's movements are almost, but not quite, human mirrors the psychic response to something that is both known and alien. This interdisciplinary crossover illustrates how Freud's early insights into the workings of the mind continue to inform our understanding of emerging technologies. To bring these threads together, consider a single metaphor that captures the essence of Freud's cultural ripple. Imagine a stone dropped into a still pond. The stone is Freud's original theory of the unconscious, and the pond is the cultural landscape of the 20th century. The first concentric circles are the immediate reactions, psychoanalytic clinics, the early literary readings, the surrealist paintings. As the circles expand, they intersect with other ripples. The existentialist critique, the feminist backlash, the post-structuralist deconstruction. Each intersection creates a new pattern, a complex interference that reshapes the surface of the pond. The stone never stops moving. It continues to generate new waves long after it has sunk. This metaphor helps us see why Freud's influence persists. It is not a static imprint, but a dynamic process of interaction, reinterpretation, and resistance. In closing, we might ask ourselves, what is the ultimate legacy of Freud's penetration into culture, art, and other disciplines? Is it the specific concepts, the Oedipus complex, the death drive, the uncanny, that endure, or is it the methodological spirit of probing beneath the surface, of listening to the silences and the slips? Perhaps it is both. Freud gave us a vocabulary for the hidden, a set of tools for excavating the psychic terrain, and a daring confidence that the mind, like any other terrain, can be mapped, even if imperfectly. His ideas have been embraced, reshaped, and contested, but they have never been silenced. As we navigate the complexities of contemporary life, where digital avatars mask inner anxieties, where global narratives intersect with personal fantasies, Freud's reminder that the mind is like an iceberg, only 1/10 visible, remains as relevant as ever. So as we listen to the echo of Freud's voice across a century of art, literature, philosophy, and politics, let us remember that each reverberation carries with it both the weight of its origin and the imprint of every mind that has heard it. The ripple effect is not a simple spreading of influence. It is a conversation across time, a dialogue between the past and the present, a perpetual unfolding of meaning that invites each new generation to look deeper, to question more boldly, and perhaps to understand a little better the hidden currents that shape us all. The story of Sigmund Freud does not end with the publication of the Interpretation of Dreams in 1900, nor with the eventual decline of psychoanalysis in the clinics of the 1970s. It continues, still unfolding, in the corridors of modern psychotherapy, in the humming of neuroimaging machines, and in the quiet conversations of scholars who seek to bridge the gap between the mind's hidden currents and the brain's observable activity. In this segment, we will travel together through the contemporary re-evaluation of Freud's legacy, tracing how neo-Freudian thinkers reshaped his ideas, how clinicians today apply psychodynamic principles to complex disorders, and how neuroscientists both echo and challenge the old psychoanalytic map. We will listen to the voices of those who defend the relevance of the unconscious and those who caution against turning metaphor into measurement. Along the way, we will pause for anecdotes that reveal the human drama behind the academic debates, and we will consider how the conversation has been enriched by thinkers such as Daniel Stern, Mark Soames, and the broader embodied cognition movement. Let us begin with the first wave of revision that emerged not long after Freud's own death. While Freud's original structural model, id, ego, and superego, cast the psyche as a battlefield of instinctual drives and moral authority, his younger colleagues and disciples sensed both the power and the limits of that metaphor. Erik Erikson, for instance, took the psychoanalytic emphasis on early childhood conflict and extended it across the entire lifespan. In his seminal work, Childhood and Society, Erikson proposed 8 psychosocial stages, each defined by a dialectic of crisis and resolution. Trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame, and so forth, culminating in integrity versus despair in old age. He wrote, "The ego is not a static structure but a dynamic process that must adapt to the social world." In this way, Erikson preserved Freud's insight that early experiences shape later identity, yet he relocated the focus from instinctual energy to the social environment, suggesting that the ego's development is a lifelong negotiation with culture. Anna Freud, the founder of child psychoanalysis and the daughter who inherited her father's clinic, turned her attention to the defenses that the ego employs to manage anxiety. In her The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense, she cataloged repression, projection, displacement, and a host of other operations, arguing that these defenses are not merely pathological, but also essential tools for mental equilibrium. She famously observed, "The ego is a defensive structure, but it is also a creative one, capable of synthesizing experience into a coherent self." By foregrounding the ego's capacity for adaptation, Anna Freud softened the deterministic edge of her father's drive theory, offering clinicians a more nuanced vocabulary for interpreting children's play, fantasies, and resistances. Melanie Klein, working in the early 20th century London clinic, took the psychoanalytic lens in a different direction. She emphasized the infant's internal world of objects, both real and imagined, and argued that even before birth the mind is already organizing experiences of love and aggression. In her writings on the paranoid, schizoid, and depressive positions, she described how the infant oscillates between seeing the mother as a good object that nourishes and a bad object that frustrates. Klein's famous line, "The infant's unconscious is a theater of projections," invites us to imagine the mind as a stage where internalized relationships are constantly rehearsed. Her object relations theory, later taken up by the British School of Psychoanalysis, deepened the focus on relational patterns, paving the way for contemporary approaches that view psychopathology as a disturbance in the capacity to form secure attachments. These neo-Freudian expansions did not merely add new stages or defenses, they also reframed the therapeutic relationship. Whereas Freud's classical analysis often relied on the analyst's neutrality and the couch setting, Erikson, Anna Freud, and Klein each highlighted the relational context as a co-construction between therapist and patient. This shift is palpable in today's psychodynamic practice, where the therapist's presence, empathy, and even counter-transference become therapeutic tools rather than obstacles. Consider, for a moment, a modern clinical example that illustrates this evolution: psychodynamic therapy for borderline personality disorder, BPD. Historically, BPD was viewed through a purely behavioral lens, with interventions focused on symptom reduction. Yet since the 1990s, clinicians have revisited the psychodynamic understanding of BPD as a disorder of identity diffusion, affective instability, and intense fear of abandonment, core themes that echo Freud's concept of unresolved early conflicts and the fragmentation of the ego. In a contemporary outpatient setting, a therapist might begin by establishing a safe, consistent therapeutic frame, inviting the patient to explore moments of dissociation as breaks in the narrative flow of self. Through the careful interpretation of transference, when the patient projects past attachment wounds onto the therapist, the clinician helps the individual recognize that the storm they feel inside is not an isolated catastrophe, but a reenactment of earlier relational ruptures. Studies from the personality disorders, collaborative longitudinal study, PDCLS, have shown that such psychodynamic interventions can lead to significant reductions in self-harm, improved affect regulation, and a measurable increase in the patient's capacity for reflective functioning. In the words of one therapist, when we name the feeling of abandonment as it rises in the session, we give it a shape that can be held, rather than a phantom that drives impulsivity. A second modern illustration involves transference-focused psychotherapy, TFP, in trauma work. Developed by Otto Kernberg and his colleagues, TFP explicitly utilizes the patient's transferences, the unconscious expectations and emotions projected onto the therapist, as a laboratory for revisiting traumatic memories. In a case of a combat veteran with complex PTSD, the therapist might notice the patient's sudden anger toward the therapist after a session discussing a mundane topic. This anger, the therapist discerns, is not about the present moment but a reenactment of the veteran's experience of betrayal by commanding officers. By interpreting this transference, the therapist helps the veteran differentiate the past betrayal from the current therapeutic relationship, thereby weakening the grip of the trauma memory. Empirical work published in the Journal of Traumatic Stress reports that TFP can produce effect sizes comparable to, and in some measures exceeding, those of trauma-focused CBT, especially in the domain of affective integration and identity cohesion. The therapist's stance, therefore, is not merely supportive but actively interpretive, weaving the patient's present feelings into a broader narrative of unresolved loss and aggression. These examples demonstrate how the neo-Freudian emphasis on relational dynamics and ego functions continues to inform treatment. Yet, as we move further into the 21st century, another set of voices enters the conversation. Neuroscientists who seek to map Freud's abstract constructs onto brain activity. The limbic system, for instance, has become a focal point for researchers interested in repression. Early experiments using functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, have shown that when participants are asked to suppress emotionally charged memories, there is heightened activation in the amygdala and reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex, a pattern that some scholars interpret as a neural correlate of repression. In a 2018 study, Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett and colleagues reported that the act of pushing away a memory engages the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, a region implicated in self-referential processing. One might hear Freud's own words echoing across the scanner room: the conscious is a thin veneer over a vast unconscious sea. The modern brain image, with its swirling patterns of activation, seems to give a visual metaphor to that metaphor. Another line of research explores the default mode network, DMN, a set of brain regions that become active during mind-wandering, daydreaming, and self-reflection. The DMN's activity resembles what Freud described as the free association of thoughts that surface when the mind is not occupied with external tasks. A 2020 paper by Mark Soames and Carl Friston proposes that the DMN may serve as a neural substrate for the unconscious, maintaining a continuous stream of internally generated predictions that shape perception and behavior. Soames, a neuropsychoanalyst who bridges Freud's theories with modern neurobiology, writes, "The brain is not a passive organ receiving sensory data. It is an active interpreter, constantly generating narratives that we may not be aware of." This view aligns with the psychoanalytic notion that unconscious fantasies guide our actions, even when we are unaware of them. Yet, as compelling as these neuroscientific parallels may appear, they are not without fierce criticism. One prominent counterargument asserts that neuroimaging cannot validate psychoanalytic constructs because the latter are fundamentally interpretive, metaphorical, and context-dependent. Dr. Adrian Raine, a critic of neuropsychoanalysis, argues that the brain scan is a photograph of blood flow, not a map of psychic meaning. He contends that the risk lies in reifying metaphors, turning the unconscious into a literal brain region, thereby stripping away the clinical nuance that arises from the therapeutic dialogue. Moreover, he warns that the seductive allure of brain images may lead clinicians to prioritize neurobiological explanations at the expense of the relational work that lies at the heart of psychodynamic therapy. A second counterargument focuses on the comparative effectiveness of psychodynamic therapy versus cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. Meta-analyses published in Psychological Bulletin and JAMA Psychiatry have reported that psychodynamic interventions produce effect sizes that are, on average, comparable to those of CBT for a range of disorders, including depression, anxiety, and personality disorders. Proponents of this view argue that the long-standing criticism of psychodynamic therapy, that it is unscientific or ineffective, has been largely disproven by rigorous randomized controlled trials. However, skeptics point out that many of these studies suffer from methodological limitations, small sample sizes, therapist allegiance bias, and a lack of long-term follow-up. They maintain that while psychodynamic therapy may indeed be beneficial, the claim that it matches CBT's efficacy across the board remains insufficiently substantiated. These debates are not merely academic. They have played out in vivid historical moments that shape the public perception of psychoanalysis. In 1995, the American Psychological Association, APA, convened a landmark debate titled "Is Psychoanalysis a Science?" The panel featured staunch defenders such as Dr. Nancy McWilliams, who invoked the richness of clinical case formulation, and vocal critics like Dr. Paul Meehl, who demanded falsifiable hypotheses and empirical rigor. The discussion spiraled into a heated exchange when Meehl declared, "Without measurable predictions, psychoanalysis remains a narrative, not a science." McWilliams responded with a measured pause, reminding the audience that the lived experience of patients often defies quantification, yet still yields profound transformation. The debate did not resolve the controversy, but it crystallized the tension between narrative depth and empirical demand, a tension that continues to animate contemporary research. A decade later, in 2003, another drama unfolded not in a lecture hall but in the streets of London. The Freud Museum, housed in the former home of Sigmund and Martha Freud, became the center of a public dispute when a group of activists demanded the removal of a portrait of Freud that they claimed glorified a patriarchal and outdated science. The museum's director, Dr. Peter Swales, defended the portrait as a historical artifact, quoting Freud's own assertion, "Being entirely honest with oneself is a good exercise." Protesters, however, argued that the museum should contextualize Freud's work within its historical limitations, especially regarding gender and sexuality. The controversy sparked a broader conversation about how societies remember intellectual figures, whether we preserve their contributions as immutable truths or re-examine them through the lens of contemporary values. It also reminded us that the legacy of Freud is not a static monument but a living dialogue, constantly reinterpreted by each generation. Returning to the present, we find that contemporary thinkers are weaving together these strands: neo-Freudian relational theory, modern psychodynamic practice, and neuroscientific insight into a richer tapestry. Daniel Stern, a developmental psychologist, emphasized the present-moment experience of infants, focusing on affective attunement and the sense of self-other co-creation. His concept of vitality affects resonates with Freud's idea of libidinal energy, yet Stern grounds it in observable mother-infant interactions, offering a bridge between internal drives and external relational patterns. Mark Soames, as mentioned earlier, advances a neuropsychoanalytic framework that treats the brain's predictive coding mechanisms as the physiological substrate of Freud's unconscious. He proposes that dreams, for example, are the brain's way of rehearsing possible futures, a modern reinterpretation of Freud's Royal Road to the unconscious. Meanwhile, the embodied cognition movement challenges the mind-body split that underlies much of classical psychoanalysis, arguing that cognition arises from the body's sensory-motor engagement with the world. This perspective dovetails with the neo-Freudian emphasis on the body's role in affect regulation, suggesting that therapeutic interventions that incorporate bodily awareness, such as somatic experiencing or sensory-motor psychotherapy, may enhance the efficacy of psychodynamic work. Imagine a therapist working with a young adult who presents with chronic anxiety and a pervasive sense of inadequacy. The therapist, informed by Anna Freud's defense theory, notices the patient's habitual intellectualization, a mental shield that converts feeling into abstract analysis. Drawing on Stern's vitality effects, the therapist invites the patient to notice subtle bodily sensations that accompany the anxiety, perhaps a tightening chest or a fluttering throat. By naming these sensations, the therapist helps the patient move from a purely cognitive defense to an embodied awareness, thereby loosening the grip of repression. Simultaneously, the therapist may reference Soames's neurobiological model, explaining that the brain's predictive circuits are constantly trying to anticipate threat, and that mindfulness of bodily signals can recalibrate those predictions. This integrative approach illustrates how the Neo-Freudian lineage, contemporary psychodynamic technique, and neuroscience can converge in a single therapeutic encounter. In the realm of research, this convergence is evident in studies that combine fMRI with psychodynamic interventions. A 2022 trial at the University of Zurich examined patients with major depressive disorder undergoing short-term psychodynamic therapy. Researchers measured changes in the default mode network before and after treatment, finding that reductions in rumination correlated with decreased DMN connectivity, mirroring the therapist's goal of helping patients disengage from self-referential loops. The authors concluded that psychodynamic therapy may facilitate a functional reorganization of the brain's intrinsic networks, supporting the clinical observation of increased emotional flexibility. Such findings do not prove Freud's theory in a strict Popperian sense, but they do suggest that the therapeutic processes he described may have measurable neural correlates, a point that both excites and unsettles scholars on either side of the debate. The question then is not whether Freud's ideas are proven in the laboratory, but how they continue to inform our understanding of human experience. When we speak of repression, we might consider both the psychoanalytic metaphor of pushing unwanted material into the unconscious and the neurobiological finding that the prefrontal cortex can inhibit amygdala responses. When we discuss transference, we might see it as both a reenactment of early attachment patterns and a manifestation of predictive coding that shapes interpersonal expectations. When we evaluate therapy outcomes, we can appreciate both the statistical effect sizes reported in meta-analyses and the lived narratives of patients who describe a newfound capacity for self-reflection. In this way, the contemporary re-evaluation of Freud becomes a multidimensional dialogue where each discipline contributes its language, its methods, and its humility. Let us pause for a moment and ask, what does it mean for a theory to be re-evaluated? Is it a process of discarding the old in favor of the new, or is it a conversation across time, where ideas are refined, expanded, and sometimes repurposed? The Neo-Freudians demonstrate that re-evaluation can be a creative act. Erikson's psychosocial stages, for example, do not reject Freud's emphasis on early childhood. They simply add layers of social context, suggesting that the ego must continually negotiate the demands of culture. Anna Freud's defense mechanisms do not deny the id's existence. They illuminate how the ego mediates between instinct and reality. Melanie Klein's object relations theory does not abandon the notion of unconscious fantasy. It deepens the focus on relational internal objects that shape psychic life from the earliest moments. Each of these thinkers took Freud's core insights and asked, what else could be at play? Their answers have become part of the fabric of modern psychotherapy. In the clinical arena, the re-evaluation continues. Psychodynamic therapy for borderline personality disorder, for instance, has evolved from the classical long-term analysis to time-limited, evidence-based protocols that still honor the centrality of the therapeutic relationship. The therapist's stance is no longer a distant observer, but an engaged participant, attuned to the patient's oscillations between idealization and devaluation. Transference-focused psychotherapy for trauma similarly moves beyond the notion of working through in a neutral setting. It embraces the patient's present emotional states as a gateway to previously compartmentalized memories. These approaches reflect a synthesis of Freud's emphasis on unconscious conflict, Erikson's developmental perspective, and contemporary findings that emotion regulation can be reshaped through relational experiences. At the same time, neuroscience offers both validation and caution. The limbic system's involvement in emotional memory aligns with Freud's idea that repressed material remains active beneath consciousness, yet the brain's plasticity suggests that these memories are not permanently sealed. They can be reconsolidated, altered, or even erased under certain conditions. The default mode network's role in self-referential thought resonates with the psychoanalytic focus on inner narrative, but the network's fluid connectivity also reminds us that the mind is not a static architecture. It is a dynamic process, constantly reconfiguring in response to experience. Such insights encourage therapists to view the mind as a living system, where interventions can induce measurable changes in brain function, a perspective that bridges the gap between the talking cure and the biological cure. Nevertheless, the counterarguments remind us to remain vigilant. The claim that neuroimaging cannot fully capture the richness of psychoanalytic constructs urges caution against reductionism. While a scan can show activation patterns, it cannot read the symbolic meaning that a patient assigns to a dream, a fantasy, or a relational pattern. Likewise, the debate over effect sizes reminds us that therapeutic success is not solely a numbers game. The therapeutic alliance, the patient's personal narrative, and the cultural context all shape outcomes in ways that statistical models can only approximate. As the philosopher of science Karl Popper once noted, a theory is not falsified by a single experiment, but by a systematic pattern of contradictory evidence. In the case of psychoanalysis, the evidence is mixed, complex, and often situated within the lived stories of patients and clinicians alike. Returning to our historical anecdotes, the 1995 APA debate and the 2003 Freud Museum controversy both illustrate how the re-evaluation of Freud is as much a social and cultural process as it is an intellectual one. The APA debate forced the field to confront the standards of scientific legitimacy, prompting a wave of empirical research that sought to test psychoanalytic hypotheses with greater methodological rigor. The Freud Museum controversy, meanwhile, highlighted the ethical dimension of honoring a thinker whose theories have been used both to alleviate suffering and to justify oppressive practices. The museum's eventual decision to add contextual panels addressing Freud's historical context and the critiques of his work serves as a reminder that re-evaluation also involves ethical responsibility, recognizing both the contributions and the shortcomings of a legacy. In the present moment, as we stand at the intersection of psychodynamic theory, clinical practice, and brain science, we can draw inspiration from the interdisciplinary dialogue that Freud himself might have welcomed. He famously said, "The mind is like an iceberg, only a small part is visible above the water." Today, the iceberg is no longer a metaphor for hidden drives alone. It is a model that includes neural circuitry, bodily sensations, and cultural narratives. By acknowledging the layers beneath the surface, psychic, physiological, relational, we honor the spirit of Freud's curiosity while embracing the tools of contemporary inquiry. Consider an analogy that may help to integrate these perspectives. Imagine a symphony orchestra. Freud's original theory is akin to the first violin section, providing the dominant melody that guides the piece. The Neo-Freudians add woodwinds and brass, enriching the harmony with new timbres and counter-melodies that reflect social and relational dimensions. Modern psychodynamic clinicians are the conductors, shaping the flow of the music, listening for discord, and guiding the ensemble toward coherence. Neuroscientists, in turn, are the acousticians, measuring the vibrations, mapping how sound waves travel through the hall, and identifying how the audience's physiological responses align with the music. Each role is distinct, yet the performance is only complete when all are in dialogue. The audience, our patients, and the broader public experiences the integrated whole, even if they are not aware of each individual contribution. As we reflect on this integrated view, it becomes clear that the contemporary re-evaluation of Freud is not a simple verdict of right or wrong. It is a nuanced process of translation, where ideas are adapted to new languages, developmental psychology, neurobiology, embodied cognition, without losing their essential insight that human behavior is driven by forces that often lie beyond immediate awareness. The ongoing conversation invites us to ask, how can we honor the depth of the unconscious while embracing the precision of brain imaging? How can we preserve the therapeutic power of transference while ensuring that our interventions are grounded in evidence? These questions, like the ones Freud posed a century ago, keep the field vibrant and open to discovery. In closing, let us remember that the legacy of Freud lives not in a static monument, but in the continual act of re-evaluation, through the work of Erikson, Anna Freud, and Klein. Through the hands of clinicians who apply psychodynamic principles to borderline personality disorder and trauma, through the scans that illuminate the limbic system and the default mode network, through the critiques that remind us of the limits of measurement, and through the interdisciplinary bridges built by thinkers such as Daniel Stern, Mark Soames, and the proponents of embodied cognition. As we move forward, may we carry the humility to listen to the patient's story, the curiosity to explore the brain's mysteries, and the courage to revise our theories in light of new evidence. In doing so, we honor the spirit of inquiry that Freud so passionately championed, while forging a path that is both scientifically rigorous and deeply human.